When Boris Yeltsin resigned as president of the Russian Federation, it was expected but sudden. He resigned so his prime minister, Vladimir Putin, could become president on January 1st, 2000, the start of the new millennium. Since then, Putin has been the most powerful man in Russia and one of the most powerful men in the world. Today, that power has been felt worldwide as the war rages in Ukraine, contributing to gas price hikes, food insecurity in many countries, and not exactly helping the soaring inflation felt around the world. It may surprise many to learn that this man, who was only the Russian Federation's second president, is not a career politician and had his position more or less thrust upon him precisely because of this. So, how did Vladimir Putin come to power in the first place, and how has he managed to maintain his position as the leader of Russia for quite so long? Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7th, 1952 in Leningrad. Vladimir's father, also called Vladimir, was a factory worker and a former soldier who fought in the siege of Leningrad. His mother Maria gave birth to two sons who died before Vladimir was born. At first, the family lived in a communal apartment that was barely big enough for them, let alone the other two families they had to share it with. As you might have deduced from all of this, Putin grew up in poverty and would get into fights around his apartment building, a habit that would land him in trouble as an adult and even risk jeopardizing his career at points. This habit would also lead him to channel that energy into Sambo, a Russian martial art that combines catch-as-catch-can wrestling with judo. Putin would later practice judo proper, and it is one of the things he is known for on the world stage. As for education, Vladimir did not get good grades at first, but the chance to join a sports club to learn martial arts inspired him to improve his mind as well, along with another motivation to improve his marks, which we'll get into shortly. He also learned German in school, which would likewise greatly influence his trajectory later. What may come as a surprise, given where he's ended up, is that Putin was politics averse as a youth. For example, he declined to join the youth wing of the Communist Party, even as he was pressured to do so by teachers and fellow students. However, Putin would eventually relent and find that he was a natural leader. One thing that he was far more interested in, even as a child, however, was spycraft. As a teenager, he dreamed of joining the KGB, inspired by approved literature and film about Soviet spies during World War II. There circulates, whether fully accurate or not, a famous story where in 1968 a teenage Putin walked into the KGB headquarters in Leningrad and asked a guard what he needed to study in order to get into the KGB. The guard told him he should study law. Allegedly emboldened by the response, Putin started to put more energy into school, hoping to enter Leningrad State University for law, and ultimately achieved this goal. However, he was warned by his coaches and friends early on that he would not enjoy the more realistic life of a KGB officer compared to the one he saw in films. Still, Putin persisted, and his studies in university instilled in him a great respect for law and order. He ultimately interned for the city's transport ministry in its criminal division until he wound up getting recruited to the KGB in 1975. In 1976, Putin became a first lieutenant, working for the KGB's counterintelligence department, the Second Chief Directorate. Here, he learned how to recruit informants and collaborators in the war with the Soviet Union's internal enemies. As much talk of deep states in modern conspiracy theories, but the KGB was truly a state within a state. It monitored everything to ensure law and order within and without the Soviet Union, and Putin learned a lot from his time working for them. The without part is something Putin would become more familiar with, as after 6 months he was transferred to the First Chief Directorate, which handled intelligence outside of the borders of the Soviet Union. That said, while you might envision Hollywood spy-type scenarios were his daily life, in fact, according to journalist and biographer Masha Gensen, quote, Putin and his colleagues were reduced mainly to collecting press clippings, thus contributing to the mountains of useless information produced by the KGB. Nevertheless, his employment in the KGB brought out a side of Putin that would become central to his rise to power. He worked. He worked hard, meticulously, and he kept his head down. He had ambitions, no doubt, but they don't appear to have been initially to rule the country or party, but rather to advance in the KGB. For now, he monitored and shadowed foreigners in Leningrad until 1985, when he would be sent to the Red Banner Institute for training in foreign intelligence. This was the real spy school where he fulfilled his childhood dream. However, his fondness for fighting continued as an adult, with the consequence that his conduct conduct there resulted in him being unable to get into the Secret Service. Instead, he was assigned to Dresden in East Germany because of his knowledge of German. There he worked with the KGB and the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, during the last half-decade of the Eastern Bloc. There, he immersed himself in German culture and by all accounts performed his duties with distinction. The unraveling of Eastern Germany, which was most dramatically captured in the fall of the Berlin Wall, impacted Putin deeply. He saw the Soviet Union's reach in the area crumble before his eyes, and Moscow unable to even relay simple orders to the KGB amidst the chaos. In 1989, he returned home to Russia. Due to Gorbachev's social and economic reforms like glasnost and perestroika, the Soviet Union's days were visibly at an end at home as well. Putin didn't know what the future held for him, either as a Russian or as a KGB officer. This was not unique to him, as for most Russians, the future was uncertain. A way of life was coming to an end, and there was a lot of chaos in building a new one. While still working for the KGB, he was assigned the position of assistant to the rector at Leningrad State University. This was a semi-official KGB post used to spy on foreign students. And now into the picture, Anatoly Sobchak, a professor of law at the university and would-be democratic reformer. Sobchak recruited Putin in May of 1990 for his elections to the city council. In this, Putin disclosed to Sobchak that he was an active KGB agent, but Sobchak did not mind. He ran for city council and then chairman of the city council. He wished to establish free elections for the post of mayor as part of his platform of democratic reforms. The hope was that a referendum could be held in which he would be elected mayor and the city would be renamed its original name, St. Petersburg. And that's exactly what happened in 1991. In all of this, Sobchak trusted Putin as a reliable worker, and soon he would reward him. Also during this period, Putin tried to quit the KGB twice, as his active status with the agency attracted too much scrutiny. The first time he tried to quit was in the beginning of his tenure with Sobchak. He tried again during a failed coup in 1991. However, the KGB were only too happy to have him in Sobchak's midst. They even tried to lean on Putin to supply them with a document which would allow them to manipulate Sobchak, which Putin refused to provide, not wanting to violate Sobchak's trust. His resignation was ultimately accepted, and he was officially out of the agency that had served for most of his life. Now, going back to Sobchak, his time as mayor did not go well. The democratic reformer became known as anti-democratic in his dealings with the city council. He often tried to shut them out of important decisions, kneecap his rivals and any challengers to his mayorship, and he was accused of numerous under-the-table dealings. Putin also was not immune from this seemingly shady behavior. In fact, the first rumor that Putin was using a government position to stash away quite a lot of money for his own personal gain came around this time in his then position as head of the Committee for External Relations at the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. Specifically, when he allegedly helped broker a $93 million deal to acquire various food supplies for the city. In a nutshell, various companies were granted permits that would allow them to supply huge amounts of materials to foreign entities, and in exchange, they'd be given an equivalent value back in foodstuffs to then be used within the famished city. The thing was, as far as anyone could tell, while the companies did send out the materials, no foodstuffs came back in return. The matter was ultimately investigated by one Marina Salyi at the behest of the city council, with Salyi in turn claiming Putin's signature could be found authorizing the deals. She states, "The raw materials were shipped abroad, but the food didn't materialize. There's 100% proof that in this, Putin was to blame." As a result, in 1992, when there was no food at all, the city was left with nothing. The evidence I have is as solid as it gets. Putin, well, his committee, made bartering contracts to get food for the city. He issued licenses, and commodities, wood, metal, cotton, heating oil, and oil flew out of the country. That said, while she states Putin was to blame, and at least according to her she had definitive proof, she did not find any evidence that Putin had received anything in return for the apparently botched deals. As for Putin, he claimed that the companies that had been given the export permits in the deal were to blame for the foodstuffs not coming back as they were supposed to have, implying Putin had no knowledge the deals wouldn't be completed as originally brokered when he issued the licenses. The city council would move forward with further investigation, but ultimately Mayor Sobchak put a stop to it and the matter was dropped. While you read in many outlets reporting this story that Salyi would die of so-called natural causes mere weeks after she made these accusations and the investigation was killed, in truth, she would go on to help found the Free Democratic Party of Russia and more or less continually rail against Putin to anyone in the media and the public who would listen, until eventually giving up in 2000 after the election and moving to the countryside. There she lived until her death at the age of 77 in 2012. although she still did give a handful of interviews during that span, still unabashedly anti-Putin. In any event, going back to his rise to power, Putin was linked to the federal government of the new Russia under Boris Yeltsin's administration. Sobchak and Yeltsin were friends and shared a lot of the same economic ideals that made 1990s Russia a tumultuous place. Boris Yeltsin's shock therapy was an attempt to shock Russia's economy into rapid capitalism. In the end, it also encouraged a lot of corruption and rising crime. And speaking of seediness, Sobchak's regime in St. Petersburg attempted to change the city into a Russian Las Vegas. To help him in his various ventures, Sobchak gave Putin the position of deputy mayor. This is when we can ostensibly say Putin entered politics. Putin was supposedly surprised at the promotion, but he accepted the new duties. He used his knowledge of the German culture and language to travel to Germany to foster connections for the mayor there. Putin claimed these visits changed him as he got to see West Germany for the first time and how it was so different from the former East Germany. During this time, he also researched models for casinos and in the process saw an erotic performance that shocked him to his core. This was the unfettered lust and vice of a world without strict Soviet discipline. He also came to the conclusion that if such vices were to be allowed in Russia, the profits should go to the state. Sobchak tried to reshape St. Petersburg into this image, but along with the rest of Russia, crime came calling. Corruption with these casinos was high, and the government itself was not making the types of profits from the casinos as expected. But organized crime, and presumably many of the politicians themselves, were. Organized crime became such a huge problem that contracted murders and assassinations became common. This issue gripped all of Russia, with no clear way as to solve it given the power structure and the chaos. Reporters blamed Sobchak and his inner circle for the corruption. Some of the blame even landed on Putin. However, while Putin did get paid a little more than he was at the KGB, his property remained modest for his position. Like many things in this story, this could be an attempt to clean Putin's image in the wake of his later success, and rumors swirl that his public property didn't exactly match his actual total earnings when factoring in earnings under the table, something we'll get to in a bit when we discuss how Putin accumulated his wealth and how much he actually has. Whatever the case, Sobchak did not escape scrutiny the way Putin might have. Tell-all books were published by former allies and betrayals were common. Many former deputies and aides started running against Sobchak in elections while accusing him of countless improprieties. Sobchak did not help himself either. He was focused on improving the city in all the wrong ways. He brought Henry Kissinger, Bill Clinton, Ted Turner, and other international figures for political and economic visits, some of which Putin oversaw in one of his many accumulated positions. Some of these visits led to misguided attempts at diverting business to the city, like Ted Turner's Goodwill Games. The games were a mismanaged disaster for St. Petersburg. However, any opposition to Sobchak from the council was met with undemocratic resistance from Sobchak, who would use his control of the city's TV channel to block rivals from having as much screen time as himself. In 1996, Putin's fellow deputy mayor Vladimir Yakovlev ran against Sobchak as mayor. Sobchak had his back against the wall, and Putin was allegedly horrified at Yakovlev's betrayal. In the end, Sobchak and Yakovlev made it to a runoff election which Sobchak lost. Upon his loss, an official investigation into Sobchak caused him to flee Russia. However, Putin's experience with Sobchak had made them friends, and Putin had developed a loyalty for those within Sobchak's circle and for the man himself. From this, he supposedly developed a bitter hatred for those who betrayed Sobchak. Putin's fierce loyalty and lack of forgiveness for betrayal are something the future president would come to be known for. Another trait Putin picked up in this time working for Sobchak is a distrust of the public and a growing hatred for the reach of journalism. He saw their attempts to hold officials accountable as something that got in the way of the government's work and its progress. Putin also embraced Sobchak's attempts at privatization of markets and companies the Soviet Union once controlled. He was also party to some of Sobchak's mistakes in dealing with newly privatized assets, as was all of Russia during this time of transition. Whether this was deliberate corruption on his part or growing pains is debated. However, with some who have been exiled by Putin and little reason to lie about it at this point, claiming that while Putin was no saint, it was more of the latter growing pains, as we'll get into shortly when discussing how wealthy he is these days. Whatever the case, in all this, he learned the inner workings of the government, albeit on a municipal level. Even then, Sobchak gave him very high responsibilities, such as dealing with foreign dignities. This was a natural extension of his KGB training and time in East Germany, but it is something he would carry forth with him to the federal level. Putin gained a lot of knowledge under Sobchak. He learns not so much how to gain power, but what to do with it and the many ways that it can be lost. With Sobchak's career finished, Putin found himself jobless again. However, his work with Sobchak put him in the orbit of Boris Yeltsin's people. Boris Yeltsin's Russia was not going well. It suffered a lot of the same issues St. Petersburg suffered under Sobchak. The rapid transition to a capitalist economy opens the country to rampant corruption and crime, with many politicians seeming not too upset about this given the opportunity for their own advancement. Yeltsin also dealt with two major issues Sobchak did not: an unpopular war in Chechnya between 1994 and 1996, and ailing health, which saw Yeltsin disappear from the public eye on occasion. He was, at this point, still the Federation's first president and was constantly worried about a safe transition of power. He also knew Russian history was not kind to former rulers or their families, so picking a successor with a thing for loyalty and who was able to keep him and his family safe were high on his list of qualifications. On this note, Yeltsin's Moscow had a thick atmosphere of mistrust by the time Putin fully entered that world. And this brings us to August of 1996, when a member of Yeltsin's cabinet called Putin to Moscow for an interview. The opportunity fell through, but instead of returning to St. Petersburg with nothing, Putin found himself working for Pavel Borodin of the Presidential Property Management Directorate. He worked as Borodin's deputy, and it was more or less his job to purchase the Soviet property that now lay outside of Russia's borders. From there, in March of 1997, Putin was placed in the position of Main Control Directorate. He was given authority in investigating how government money was being spent and to end government corruption wherever he could find it. From this new position, he discovered just how corrupt and damaged the Federation was. He also became respected for doing his job well and returning government control to sectors that had gone rogue due to corruption. His outsider status, competence, and staying out of the Yeltsin inner circle drama allowed Putin another promotion. He was appointed to director of the FSB, the KGB's successor. This was an attempt by Yeltsin to control the more old-fashioned leaders of the FSB by appointing someone who understood them but was loyal to him. In this position, Putin guided the FSB through some modernizing reforms that reflect some of his later interests, such as monitoring the emergent internet. He also worked to corral the old guard, reshape the FSB to Yeltsin's demands, and even deal with a torrent of scandals dealing with the Kremlin, the FSB, and tensions in Chechnya. Because of all of this, Putin was once again rewarded for his diligence. On August the 5th of that year, Yeltsin would tell Putin, a man who just a short time before was relatively unknown to the wider public, of his plan to appoint him as prime minister. Being prime minister was more than a big deal. It was the ticket to the presidency. Yeltsin was worried about his own health, and on top of that, he had a habit of firing prime ministers. Putin, the aloof yet competent outsider, showed none of the signs of machinations or overt visible corruption of the previous prime ministers. Yeltsin wanted a stable picture for whom to leave the country to avoid the repeated fates of Russia's previous rulers. On this note, he also sought a successor who would guarantee the safety of his family upon leaving power. Putin's reputation for loyalty preceded itself on that one. He was the perfect candidate. Putin supposedly did not want to accept the position at first, but he eventually folded to Yeltsin. He was also put in charge of the Security Council in March of 1999, something he would hold on to even after he became president. During this time, the Second War in Chechnya started when rebels invaded the neighboring Republic of Dagestan. This war thrust Putin into a repeat of the mid-90s. The people feared an unpopular and bloody war. However, in his stint as prime minister, he proved to be more effective in leading the war than Yeltsin was before him. As a result of this and his other work, he became popular as prime minister. His successor firmly in place, at the end of the millennium, Boris Yeltsin resigned as president. This put Putin in the position of acting president, but he would have to run for election after 6 months, which he did, winning as his predecessor had hoped. From here, Putin held on to power with little difficulty. However, in 2008, after 2 terms as president, he faced a dilemma. The constitution only allowed 2 consecutive terms for any president. To overcome this obstacle, he had his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, run for the presidency. Medvedev won and appointed Putin as prime minister. In reality, Putin held the real power and was subsequently re-elected in 2012 back to his old position. As for his presidency, Putin's outlook changed over the years with a pronounced conservative turn, starting with the ongoing tensions in Chechnya in 2004. Putin also became an ally of the Russian Orthodox Church as a byproduct of this turn. As with countless politicians, whether true or not in any given case is a matter of debate, but his asserted Christianity is often a talking point in his appeal to the people, emphasizing the importance of family and Christian values. Whatever the case there, Putin is often accused of scheming in his presidency to keep his inner circle in line and himself in power. On this note, it is speculated that he was in a rather good position for this, given his rise from the lowest ranks to the highest. Once he reached a state of power as president, he had a good understanding of how Russia worked from the municipal level all the way to the federal level. He also knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively, for all the people all the way up the chain. Further contributing to his maintaining of power, he saw the way constitutions could be manipulated. Putin believed more in the letter of the law than the spirit of the law, and any constitution in Russia did not have the same semi-scriptural status that, say, the American Constitution has. In the end, Putin's time with Sobchak showed him just how malleable constitutions are. On his own, Putin developed the idea that stability was more important than freedom, a position he has carried forth increasingly into older age. As previously alluded to, he has little love for journalists. His curtailing of the media is well known, and it largely stemmed from his time rising through the ranks. He saw media and journalism as an obstruction to the government's workings and making rapid progress, either because enterprising individuals would use the media to their advantage, whether what they said was true or not, or journalists would poke their noses into sensitive business that may hinder something ostensibly overall good for the people. Even Putin's long connections to the oligarchs did not shield some of those who ran media companies that stepped on his toes. Such is the case of the oligarch who owned NTV, which, after being critical of Putin, was given to a more Putin-friendly oligarch in 2001. Controlling the media with an iron fist is one way to stay in power, but it's not the only way. As such, Putin maintained countless connections that he made in his career. Like elsewhere, these connections remained important in Russian politics, but they were leaned on more heavily as social currency. He understood this and developed and maintained numerous such associations, even as he reached the top, continuing to keep a large core of allies loyal to him among those below him. Part of this social currency is loyalty and punishment of betrayal, which Putin took extremely seriously. Loyalty was rewarded, such as helping out Sobchak during his legal troubles heading into 2000. The system of connections is how he keeps the oligarchs in line. As long as they don't get involved in politics against him and do support him, they're more or less free to operate how they want. So what about the infamous assassination attempts that the regime is known for? Shootings and poisonings were never something Putin was known for during his time with the KGB. He denied ever committing crimes for the agency during his political rise. If anything, he had experience investigating hits and assassinations during his time with the FSB, rather than him being the one to order them. That said, it's probable he trained in assassinations at the Red Banner Institute, and it is noted that the assassinations of people like Boris Nemtsov, Boris Berezovsky, and the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny helped protect Putin's regime. Of course, whether he was directly involved or simply the people who have an interest in keeping Putin in power just take care of it for him without consulting him, is a matter of debate. Moving on from there, Putin also values the aesthetic of the old Soviet Union over its ideology. He appeals to a nostalgia of Russia's central place in the Soviet Empire, but he is no communist. One of Putin's famous quotes is, "Anyone who doesn't mourn the passing of the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who wants it restored has no brains." On a domestic level, Putin offers a form of continuity between Soviet and federal Russia that appeals to many hardliners left over from the Soviet days, while also courting those who enjoy the freedoms gained during the Federation. This is especially true for the Orthodox Christians. He also appeals to nostalgia for the Russian empires of Peter and Catherine the Great. This plays into the fears of republics like Chechnya breaking away. Such breakaways are feared to trigger a domino effect of independence movements that would weaken Russia and the pride of the Russian people. The pre-Soviet legacy hangs heavily on Putin. After all, he took part in changing Leningrad back to St. Petersburg. He often struggles to keep lands that was gained during Imperial Russia, such as the Caucasus republics. On an international level, his Soviet nostalgia is less assuring for former Eastern Bloc and Soviet republics. The presence of Russians in many of these countries and the claims of former Soviet lands have opened these countries to invasions and excursions, of which there were the wars in Georgia and Ukraine. Putin uses the specter of the Soviet Union and Russia's past as an empire to fuel the drive forward for a modern Russian identity. Now, you might note in all of this that we haven't really explicitly mentioned Putin accumulating wealth as a means for himself to stay in power or protect himself. Now, this might seem strange given that Putin is rumored to be one of, if not the wealthiest person alive today. But is Putin actually anywhere near as wealthy as the rumors say? Beyond, as mentioned, the seemingly rather shady 1990 St. Petersburg $93 million food supply scandal, which again, at least as far as anyone can tell, did not make Putin himself a single dollar richer, what about after? And what about now? Once elected, Putin, like his predecessor, began reporting his finances and holdings publicly, including his salary and exact amount in his many bank accounts. He has continued to do so since. The result? Well, over the years, while his salary has changed regularly from year to year, he has made approximately $100,000 to $190,000 American dollars annually in that span. For example, in 2018, reporting an income of $135,000 American dollars. Today, between his wife's and his own accounts, the couple seem to have a little over $500,000 in cash in various bank accounts, though why he isn't investing this is rather curious, given his apparent lack of any other investments and almost complete lack of actually needing any cash for his day-to-day life, given the government foots the bill for most of everything. Of this, Putin states, "Honestly speaking, I don't even know what my salary is. They deliver it to me, I take it, put it in my bank account, and don't even count it." As for his other assets, he also owns a studio-sized apartment in St. Petersburg, a slightly larger apartment in Moscow, owns a small garage, a couple of cars, a small plot of land outside of Moscow, and otherwise has various minor assets of no great worth. Of course, over the years, people can't help but notice that Putin has a collection of watches that he wears very publicly, whose purchase price combined is around that of his reported entire net worth, ringing in at about $400,000 to $700,000 if various reports are to be believed. For reference, the highest valued watch he has been spotted wearing costs around $140,000. It's a Patek Philippe perpetual calendar watch. Good choice. On top of that, the clothing he can often be seen wearing is likewise extremely expensive, such as his $6,000 plus tailored suits from outlets like Kiton and Brioni. Not only expensive suits, in one photo of him working out, Putin can be seen wearing sweatpants that cost over $1,400 a pair, apparently being made from silk, cashmere, and the tears of impoverished children, along with a similarly priced top. On top of that, among other mentions, he is long rumored to own an estate known as Putin's Palace near Praskovika, widely reported to be worth $1 billion by media outlets. However, this was actually sold in 2011 to one Alexander Ponomarenko, a former associate of Putin's, for somewhere around $350 million. Though the exact amount has not been publicly disclosed, but Ponomarenko has indicated that it's in the ballpark of that widely reported figure. Ponomarenko purchased the estate from a group led by businessman Nikolai Shamalov. Ponomarenko claims that he decided to buy the company behind the estate project and thus the mansion, as it was a steal of a deal owing to the project being stalled from lack of funds to complete the estate and the business group wanting to cut their losses on it rather than complete it. That said, businessman Sergei Kolesnikov, who is exiled from Russia, claims that the palace was built specifically for Putin's use. He claims Putin was able to afford its construction in part thanks to a gift given to him by the aforementioned Nikolai Shamalov in the form of 94% of the shares in a company called Lyris Holding. Among other personal knowledge of the development of the palace, Kolesnikov claims Shamalov himself told him this, and to quote him, "I have no reason not to believe him." However, no documents concerning any ownership connected to the project seem to indicate Putin or any holdings of Putin's ever were directly involved with this estate. That said, some contract documents concerning its construction allegedly have the signature of one Vladimir Kozhin, one of Putin's inner circle of confidants. Of course, this still doesn't definitively indicate whether Putin actually owned the palace or even was behind its building at all. Simply, allegedly, someone he is close with was involved in some capacity, and later someone else he is close to bought it. A bit of a theme for a lot of these rumors. Though this perhaps shouldn't come as a huge surprise, even if nothing shady is going on, given Putin's widespread connections to most of the powerful and extremely wealthy elite in Russia that comes naturally by his very position in the government. On this specific one, Putin himself denies he had anything to do with the palace being built. Nevertheless, Putin allegedly frequently visits the palace, and Federal Protective Service guards have been seen at the mansion, along with locals reportedly seeing Putin in the area regularly. Of course, among the extremely wealthy with such mansions, it is not uncommon at all to let friends and guests into one's estate whenever they please, so Putin would not actually have to own the thing to stay there, nor would it be a big ask to do so, more or less par for the course among the exorbitantly wealthy with giant mansions. That said, on top of this estate, Putin has been connected to causing or having secretly had built several other mansions, as well as yachts, planes, etc. Whether he actually owns any of these, or like Putin's palace, seemingly is just using them whenever he pleases, his flashing of extreme wealth in the case of his watches and other items, along with an awful lot of not implausible allegations of widespread corruption within his government connected to him, has led to belief that he has boatloads of money secretly stashed away in accounts throughout the world. Others speculate Putin is simply using the government coffers to finance all of these extravagances. For many items, this would not actually be that uncommon for a major world leader, if more excessive than most. For example, the replacement Air Force One planes the US president will have at his disposal have a budget of over $3 billion. The US president also gets a pretty posh mansion, the White House, and vacation spots to go to at their leisure, with the taxpayer footing the bill for quite a lot of such perks, with few batting an eyelid at these extravagances. But of course, the US government isn't funding $140,000 of watches for the president, though bulletproof tailored suits occasionally worn by the president are presumably paid for by the US taxpayer. For more on this incredibly thin bulletproof fabric, go see our video, How Many Times Can You Shoot Through a Bulletproof Vest Before It Stops Working? To attempt to clarify these items, requests have been made to the Russian government asking if, for example, Putin's watches are actually his property or property of the state that he is simply wearing, but no answer to this question has been given that we could find. Whatever the case, and going back to the issue of how he has stayed in power so long, yet others claim Putin is simply enriching many people around him, and it is they who are happy to provide Putin with anything and everything his judo master heart can desire. Yet others claim it's all three. Putin is enriching himself through shady means and using government funds and people he is helping make wealthy to get whatever he wants while he's in office. But what does the man himself say about all these rumors of him accumulating insane amounts of wealth? To quote him, "I am the wealthiest man, not just in Europe, but in the whole world." Case closed, right? He admitted it. Well, in truth, he wasn't finished talking. He goes on, "I collect emotions. I am wealthy in that the people of Russia have twice entrusted me with the leadership of a great nation such as Russia. I believe that is my greatest wealth." Of course, whether he collects emotions or not doesn't inherently negate the first part of that statement, simply that he considers that a greater wealth than whatever he has possession-wise. Argue amongst yourself whether this was Putin cleverly admitting to being the wealthiest person in the world while making it seem like he was saying he wasn't, and also simultaneously admitting he's a lizard person, given a hallmark of these creatures is apparently feeding on human emotions. For a more direct answer to the question about the rumors of his extreme wealth, he clarifies, "It's just chit-chat, nonsense, nothing to discuss. They picked it out of their noses and smeared it on their pieces of paper." The Press and Information Office of the President of the Russian Federation also asserts of these rumors, this information has no substance. As you may know, the declarations of Mr. Putin's income and property are published annually. We recommend you to use only reliable sources henceforward and not to believe fake news. Naturally, nobody seems satisfied with these assertions, given his apparent and frequent flashing of wealth far beyond what anyone with his salary should be able to afford. So what do others who might know a little bit more say? First, we have political analyst and noted critic of Putin, Stanislav Belkovsky, who claimed to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in 2012 that Putin had a net worth of approximately $70 billion, though how he came up with that figure isn't exactly definitive, nor does it inspire a lot of confidence. In his own words, the figure of $40 billion emerged in 2007. That figure could now have changed. I believe at the level of $60 to $70 billion. Maximum, we cannot know. I suspect there are some businesses I know nothing about. Mildly more concrete, at least in terms of giving something more specific, he also claims much of this wealth is because of Putin's alleged 4.5% stake in Gazprom, 37% stake in Surgutneftgaz, and an allegedly 50% ownership stake of Gunvor. How he knows this, however, isn't fully clear. Belkovsky simply states he got this information through sources he has within the companies. It's also noted that for a time, Gunvor was co-owned by a friend of Putin's, billionaire Gennady Timchenko. But what do the three companies say? say. For whatever it's worth, corporate affairs director of the Swiss-based Gunvor Group, Seth Thomas Pietrus, states, President Putin has never had any interest in, investment in, or involvement with Gunvor Group either directly or indirectly. Mr. Belkovsky's claims are based on absolutely nothing and are fundamentally ridiculous. And the US government, despite its statement, has never sanctioned Gunvor in any capacity, nor has it provided any evidence of its own. Moving on to Surrogate Neftegas, they likewise deny Putin owns any shares. Gazprom, which is majority owned by the Russian government itself with the rest of the stock publicly traded, likewise shows no records of Putin owning any shares. Belkovsky counters these denials by the companies and lack of records, stating Putin has a rather elaborate network of offshore companies and funds that own the shares, which all ultimately mask that he himself actually owns, or at least controls them. Now let's move on to the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, Bill Browder. He is the one that seems to have started the widespread rumor that Putin's personal wealth is in excess of $200 billion, stating before a Senate Judiciary Committee, I believe he is worth $200 billion. The purpose of the Putin regime has been to commit terrible crimes in order to get that money. He keeps his money in the West, and all of his money in the West is potentially exposed to asset freezes and confiscation. Therefore, he has a significant and very personal interest in finding a way to get rid of the Magnitsky sanctions. On this latter note, one of Browder's former associates, Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, was investigating corruption within the Russian government and allegedly found evidence of various Russian officials taking part in a near $250 million tax fraud scheme. Magnitsky himself was then arrested for allegedly being the mastermind behind the tax fraud and died while in jail before his trial. Because of course he did. At the partial encouragement of Browder, the US then passed the Magnitsky Act in 2009. In an oversimplified nutshell, this allows the US government to sanction various individuals thought to be human rights offenders, ban them from entering the US, and more importantly, freeze their assets where the government is able. The bill was essentially meant to allow the government to legally hold somewhat accountable those thought to have been involved in Magnitsky's death. As for hard data, however, Browder offers little. Next up, noted economist Anders Aslund, author of the book Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market Economy to Kleptocracy, states, I would estimate that Putin is worth around $100 to $160 billion. We can see that Putin and his friends have taken $10 to $15 billion from Gazprom every year since 2014. And that's just Gazprom. There are large numbers of transactions being made. What's much more difficult is to see where the money goes. It's typically Cyprus, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and Wilmington, Delaware. As to how he came up with these figures, he states, my assessment is that since Putin's circle got its looting fully organized around 2006, they've extracted $15 to $25 billion a year, reaching a total of $195 to $325 billion, a large share of the Russian private offshore wealth. Presuming that half of this wealth belongs to Putin, his net worth should amount to $100 to $160 billion. Naturally, Putin and his cronies cannot enjoy their wealth. It's all about power. If they are not the wealthiest, they fear they will lose power. Why he assumes Putin would get half of these alleged amounts instead of some other percentage is not fully clear. On that note, like so many before, nobody seems to be able to actually offer hard evidence that Putin has any money stashed away anywhere not publicly known, which, when taking sums of allegedly $200 billion, is a pretty neat trick for someone who has been so highly scrutinized, including by the US Senate, who presumably, if they wanted, could just ask the CIA or other entities good at collecting such data to look into it. Given instead they are asking the likes of Browder, it has been presumed and widely claimed that the CIA and other such government entities have no definitive intelligence on this either. From this lack of a paper trail directly linking money or assets to Putin, yet his clearly lavish lifestyle, indicating he does indeed have access to an awful lot of money, this has led many to conclude that Putin himself doesn't actually officially own most or all of the wealth attributed to him, but rather he is leveraging his position and connections to enrich those close to him, who, in their gratitude, are more than happy to provide Putin with any money or items he wants, from access to mansions to yachts to sweatpants that keep his judo jubblies extra comfortable while working out. And, of course, all of this keeps them having a vested interest in Putin staying in power, so it works out for everyone, if true. As alleged evidence for this, we turn to the 11.5 million documents from the Panama Mossack Fonseca law firm made public in 2016, dealing in offshore holdings by over 200,000 entities. While Putin himself is not listed in any of them, the documents do reveal 3 close associates of Putin's, among those having offshore holdings partially managed by the law firm, with a combined amount of around $2 billion between the trio. Despite not owning these assets, there are many claims by various individuals that Putin uses some of these, like his personal bank account, most notably the holdings of a man claimed by many in the media to be Putin's best friend, famed Russian musician and conductor Sergei Roldugin. Not just a friend, Roldugin is also the godfather to one of Putin's children and was the man who introduced Putin to Putin's wife. As for where Roldugin supposedly got his extreme wealth, beyond his noted music career starting in the 1990s, Roldugin began investing in various oil and other business entities to great success. Beyond all of this, in 2009, Roldugin was also accused of being involved in a massive multi-billion-dollar money laundering scheme in conjunction with Sberbank CIB, which allegedly profited for him greatly. That said, for those using these records as proof of Putin having money elsewhere via his associates, it should be again noted that these are the records of well over 200,000 entities throughout the world. And the vast majority who are using the firm are doing so completely legitimately, including actor Jackie Chan, who reportedly had 6 perfectly above-board offshore companies the law firm helped manage various facets of. The fact that 3 among Putin's numerous friends who are exorbitantly wealthy should be included isn't necessarily proof of anything other than that they wanted to have some assets outside of Russia, which isn't uncommon among the wealthy in Russia. As some formerly close to Putin, who have had their assets stripped away and been forced to flee the country, demonstrate, having some offshore holdings is probably a good security blanket of sorts, just in case. On this note, political scientist, professor, and author of Putin's Kleptocracy, Karen Dawisha, stated before her death from lung cancer in 2018, why is it that $150 billion left the country last year? Because they believe that their wealth can only be secured in the long term outside their own country. Coming back to the question of Putin's wealth, whether these funds are being held for him or not, this is still not Putin's money, not just technically, but we're guessing regardless of the amount of goodwill Putin has built up with these various businessmen and women, should he no longer be in power, they might quickly find themselves less than willing to continue to support his lifestyle, if that is what has been happening, as people believe. And some speculate that he might even find himself in a rather unsafe circumstance in that case, giving him even more of a vested interest in staying in power. For example, one-time billionaire and the man formerly known as Putin's banker, but now exiled from Russia, Sergei Pugachev, says everything that belongs to the territory of the Russian Federation, Putin considers to be his. Everything. Gazprom, Rosneft, private companies. Any attempt to calculate it won't succeed. He's the richest person in the world until he leaves power. As for leaving power, he goes on that Putin chose not to leave office after his first term and beyond, not because of a desire for continued power, but rather because he feared for his own safety should he no longer be in that position. Even today, Pugachev claims, I don't see any guarantees for him if he steps down. Putin doesn't see them either, which is why he finds it unlikely that Putin will ever willingly leave office. Also, for whatever it's worth, Pugachev, despite having billions stripped from himself by the Russian government, being currently in fear of his life and in exile, states in his opinion, Putin himself is not evil, nor did Putin originally plan to set up a corrupt government when he took power, simply that he surrounded himself with like-minded people whom he didn't know very well and who had served with him in the KGB. They immediately began enriching themselves. Putin wanted to get rich too. He was a pragmatic person. We talked about this. He didn't want to leave office poor. As for the Russian government's position with regards to Pugachev, it is claimed that Pugachev defrauded the government of hundreds of millions of dollars, which is why the one-time bosom buddy of Putin originally had to go on the run. Pugachev counters, the state steals something, then has to defend its theft. In my case, the scale is huge, but in other respects, this is normal contemporary practice in Russia. This has all left the one-time billionaire with, by his accounts, only about $70 million to his name, which he's kept in offshore holdings. It's got to be rough. In truth, this amount is unfortunate for him because Pugachev allegedly was offered a deal from a Russian official that if he paid $300 million to certain entities, his legal troubles in Russia would be made to be resolved to his benefit and he could return to Russia. Further, siding in the camp that Putin doesn't have hundreds of billions stashed away, he officially owns the aforementioned Karen Derwisha, who perhaps gives some of the best accounts and most concrete details of the alleged corruption within the Russian government in her book Putin's Kleptocracy, states that Putin's real worth comes from his position. He takes what he wants. When you are the president of Russia, you don't need a written contract. You are the law. Again, backing up this position, financial investigator Elberg Farl states, Putin controls wealth through proxies. He then makes up examples to illustrate. Sergei owes his fortune to Putin, so when Putin asks Sergei a favor, the favor must be honored. A luxury cruise, use of a private Dakar, expensive consumer goods, etc. Ivan owns a shipping company and owes his wealth to Putin. So when Putin requests a favor, Ivan, like Sergei, honors the request. So again, is Putin actually enriching himself in all of this? While, as Gaddafi demonstrated, it is possible to squirrel away $200 billion secretly, given the level of scrutiny thrown Putin's way by governments the world over looking into the matter, with nobody seemingly able to come up with any kind of hard evidence, most think he probably doesn't have anywhere close to such an exorbitant amount that is actually his, though it is generally accepted that he probably does have at least some significant amount stashed away somewhere. For most, however, the explanation for his rather luxurious lifestyle is more reasonably explained by the simple fact that he can pretty much have the Russian government foot the bill for anything he wants without much uproar or oversight. And it does seem like an awful lot of his compatriots have gotten exceedingly wealthy during his tenure, at least part in thanks to their connections with Putin and him leveraging his position to help facilitate their enrichment. Thus, if that is what has happened, it's reasonable enough that many of those people are happy to scratch his back whenever he feels the need for a new yacht or something, without Putin actually needing to have his name on anything to avoid the backlash that would result should he be discovered to have such things. This further also all ensures that many wealthy and powerful people have a vested interest in keeping Putin in power so long as the spice continues to flow, so to speak. Thus, going back to the question of using his wealth to stay in power, it's alleged that he doesn't exactly use any of his own money to make this happen, but it is speculated he does use money via his influence on a pretty broad scale to help ensure that he does stay in power as previously described. Make everyone loyal to him rich, and they will ensure that he's going to stay in power. Of course, as to the idea that he really does have $200 billion simply being held in other people's names, as alluded to, we're guessing even if many of these individuals are actually holding money for Putin, that should he ever step down from power and ask for that money to be given to him en masse, or even to remain in power and ask for a combined sum of $200 billion, that shortly thereafter memorials and monuments would be being built for the former Russian leader who sadly died in his sleep of natural causes. But for now, the man himself remains in power via a variety of means that really aren't that different from many a leader the world over today and throughout history. In the end, Putin is a complicated man who rose from almost nothing to heights of power few in history have achieved. Like him or hate him, he has been and continues to be one of the most important shapers of the 21st century, and his presence can be felt more now than ever with little end in sight.
Nazi Germany officially surrendered on the 7th of May 1945, with the war still raging in the Pacific against Japan and sporting a popularity rate at around 83%, so Winston, Leonard, Spencer, Churchill seemed a shoo-in to maintain his position as Prime Minister of the British Empire. Just before the announcement of the results of the election, Churchill had been at the Potsdam Conference with US President Truman and Joseph Stalin, only intending to travel home briefly to accept his victory and then back to the conference. Yet, a funny thing happens on July the 26th, 1945. The voting populace of the UK, which had turned out in record numbers of 73%, had decided to collectively say, well, thank you for your service, Winston, but we've decided to go in a different direction. It was a landslide defeat that shocked the world. While in more modern times you might think some sort of scandalous affair or offensive comment may have whipped up the mob on the interwebs, precipitating such a massive electoral fall in the span of just a couple of months, but there was no such issue here. So what happened? How did this wildly successful politician, frequently named among the top prime ministers ever in the nation, at the height of his popularity no less, and who had just helped successfully guide Britain through one of its most harrowing periods of its storied history, not just lose, but lose in a landslide? And not only this, making the whole thing even more inexplicable, he lost to a man who one of said man's own party members, Anarin Bavin, stated, seems determined to make a trumpet sound like a tin whistle. Or as the chairman of the Daily Mirror, Cecil King, would remark in 1940, he was of very limited intelligence and no personality. If one heard he was getting £6 a week in the service of the East Ham Corporation, one would be surprised he was earning so much. Or let's not stop there, as famed social reformer Beatrice Webb would remark, he looked and spoke like an insignificant elderly clerk without distinction in the voice, manner, or substance of his discourse. To realise that this little non-entity is presumably the future Prime Minister is pitiable. Or, as Churchill himself would allegedly quip about his opponent, he is a modest man, but then he has so much to be modest about. The demeaning quotes about the man Churchill lost to go on and on and on, and his own party before, during and after the election likewise tried to oust him as their leader, only to see this quiet, oft-forgotten individual who rapidly rose from a middle-class background to the heights of power, defy them all, and go on to become one of the greatest prime ministers in the history of the nation, often even ranked above Churchill himself, despite only serving in the position for a handful of years. As ever, of course, the devil is in the fascinating detail, so let us dive in and see what specifically happened to see a titan of history defeated by a man no one outside of the UK even knows the name of, yet shaped the Britain we have today, arguably significantly more so than Churchill ever did. To begin with, a little bit of a brief background for the uninitiated. Leading up to becoming Prime Minister in 1940, Winston Churchill had a rather notable career. Born in his family's Blenheim Palace on November 30th, 1874, Churchill was a member of the prominent Spencer aristocratic family on his father's side. As for his mother, she was the daughter of a wealthy American businessman, Leonard Jerome. In the interim between his birth and 1940, Churchill's exploits included variously serving as a soldier in British India, as well as taking part in the Second Boer War, and even at one point he became a famous war correspondent and author. On this latter and oft-forgotten factoid of history is that he once even wrote a fictional novel with romance undertones called Savrola, a tale of the revolution in Laurania, serialized in 1898 and later published as a complete book in 1900. Later in life, Churchill would even win a Nobel Prize in Literature. As for his prolific writing, he would variously note this was one of his methods for staving off his black dog or frequent bouts of depression. Back to his political life, and in 1900, it was in October of 1900, at the age of just 25, that he was first elected as a member of parliament, and things more or less took off rapidly from there, including by World War I being selected as First Lord of the Admiralty, a position he briefly reprised during World War II, which for the uninitiated means he was the political head of the Royal Navy. In the years leading up to World War II, fascinatingly, with regards to some things that we'll be discussing later on, despite being a member of the Conservative Party, Churchill was an outspoken opponent of his party's policy of appeasement when it came to Hitler, stating, "A country like ours, possessed of immense territory and wealth, whose defense has been neglected, cannot avoid war by dilating upon its horrors, or even by a continuous display of pacific qualities, or by ignoring the fate of the victims of aggression elsewhere. War will be avoided in present circumstances only by the accumulation of deterrence against the aggressor." He also proposed a mutual defense pact for European nations that stood in the way of Germany expanding, and urged Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to declare, if Germany were to invade Czechoslovakia, as seemed imminent, that Britain would declare war on Germany. Going the other way, instead, Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, allowing Germany to annex parts of Czechoslovakia. Churchill's efforts, however, were not totally in vain for his own popularity, with more and more supporters who also felt the British Empire's policy of appeasement was the wrong tack rallying behind him. Things picked up for him from there when, after Germany occupied Norway, the now named Norway debate resulted in a call for a vote of no confidence in Chamberlain's government. Ironically, during this, Churchill, as a member of said government, had to defend it, even as arguments were being made for him to lead the next government. Well, spare you the lengthy details, but needless to say, ultimately Churchill was chosen as Prime Minister of the eventual coalition government. He would state of this, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial." That said, nothing was smooth from here, and after France fell, there was a strong push to simply sue for peace with Germany, something Churchill strongly opposed, but with the help of Chamberlain, he was able to keep his position and use his talents as a public speaker to good use in convincing the public the right choice was to continue to fight, as did he, even after a heart attack on December 26, 1941, which was supposed to leave him bedridden for a few weeks to recover, but instead he simply soldiered on, and a mere 2 days later was giving a speech to the Canadian Parliament. So, fast forward to the victory over Germany in 1945, and at no point during his time as Prime Minister had Churchill's popularity ever dipped below 78%, and his efforts and actions during it have since generally seen him consistently ranked in the top 3 Prime Ministers in the history of the nation. Of course, with the end of the war with Germany, there was pressure to hold a general election. Comfortable in his popularity and the job his party had done throughout the war, Churchill did not fear defeat. However, he nonetheless felt it would be better to continue the coalition government until the war with Japan was over, something that was notably supported by a man by the name of Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party and Churchill's deputy prime minister, who during the war had been tasked with managing matters on the domestic front so Churchill could focus on the war effort. In stark contrast to Churchill's aristocratic background, Attlee was born the 7th of 8 children to an upper-middle-class family in Surrey on January 3, 1883. After brief work as a lawyer and then an economics lecturer, Attlee jumped into politics, before having all of that interrupted by World War I. After, however, his rise was rapid, first as mayor of Stepney, then member of parliament, and by 1935 the leader of the Labour Party, all despite widespread criticism of the man himself, with many a demeaning quote as previously alluded to. But while Attlee may not have been your typical larger-than-life stereotypical alpha-type leader, Margaret Thatcher would later note of him very accurately, quite contrary to the general tendency of politicians in the 1990s, he was all substance and no show. Going back to Churchill's wish to continue the coalition government until the war with Japan was ended, as noted, his deputy prime minister in Attlee agreed that would be best. And so it was that Attlee brought this proposal before his party to see how to proceed. Par for the course of his leadership style, however, Attlee did not give his opinion on the matter either way and let discourse about it proceed unguided from the top. Ultimately, his party almost unanimously decided to oppose the continuance. But that wasn't all. There was strong sentiment within the party that with an election looming, Attlee should step down, with the chairman of the national executive of the Labour Party, Harold Laski, writing to him that many within the party felt that, quote, "the continuance of your leadership is a grave hardship to our hopes of victory in the coming general election. Your resignation of the leadership would now be a great service to the party." Just as Mr. Churchill changed Auchinleck for Montgomery before El Alamein, so I suggest you owe it to the party to give it the chance to make a comparable change on the eve of this, the greatest of our battles. End quote. Rather than argue or really give any opinion about the matter, Attlee simply replied, "Dear Lasky, thanks for your letter, the contents of which have been noted," and then wrote to Churchill of the rejection of continuing the coalition government. Thus, an election was called for and Churchill resigned on May 23, 1945 to await a vote. In the interim, King George VI charged Churchill with forming a new government, often called the Caretaker Ministry today, to oversee things during the election, with this ministry lasting from May 23 to July 26. And so it was that the unassuming Attlee, who wasn't even popular within his own party, and said Labour Party, which had never won a majority in their history, was pitted up against one of the most popular men in Britain, and against the Conservative Party, which had dominated for years and had just seen the nation through one of its most harrowing periods in history and come out the other side on top. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out, everything. And in fact, the election was already lost about 3 years before it even started, thanks to one document which we're going to get to in a bit, that would change British history. Just nobody, not even the Labour Party members, realised it until the day the votes were tallied. Of course, Churchill and the Conservative Party's campaign practices didn't exactly help matters. While it seems they'd already lost before they'd begun, their shockingly tone-deaf campaign certainly did nothing to turn the tide, and Churchill himself, known for his amazing oration, continually put his foot in his mouth in remarkably boneheaded ways, more akin to political discussions on the artist formerly known as Twitter than what we think of when conjuring up thoughts of Winston Churchill. The most famous instance of this was Churchill's infamous Gestapo speech against Attlee and Labour. Leading up to the speech, Churchill's wife Clementine and several others had advised him to take that Gestapo part of the speech out, but he doggedly soldiered on. So what exactly did Churchill say? No socialist government conducting the entire life and industry of the country could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance. They will gather all the power to the Supreme Party and the party leaders, rising like stately pinnacles above their vast bureaucracies of civil servants, no longer servants and no longer civil. Needless to say, comparing his own deputy prime minister in Attlee and the Labour Party Attlee led, who'd done a bang-up job during the war handling the domestic front so Churchill could focus on the war, to members of the Gestapo, didn't sit well with the people for reasons outlined by Churchill's own daughter Sarah, who would also try to reason with her father on this point. She stated they will certainly not tolerate totalitarianism, but they will not understand why socialism leads to this, because socialism as practiced in the war did no one harm and quite a lot of people good. The children of this country have never been so well fed or healthy. What milk there was shared equally. The rich did not die because their meat ration was no larger than the poor, and there is no doubt that this common sharing and feeling of sacrifice was one of the strongest bonds that unified us. So why, they say, cannot this common feeling of sacrifice be made to work as effectively in peace? As for Attlee himself, the next day after Churchill's little early form of Godwin's Law, as an online discussion grows larger, the probability of a comparison to involving Nazis or Hitler approaches 1. Attlee would state, "When I listened to the Prime Minister's speech last night, I realised at once what was his object. He wanted the electors to understand how great was the difference between Winston Churchill, the great leader in war of a united nation, and Mr. Churchill, the party leader of the Conservatives. He feared lest those who had accepted his leadership in war might be tempted out of gratitude for having followed him further. I thank him for having disillusioned them so thoroughly. Sick burn." Nevertheless, seemingly not reading the room, Churchill would double down on this sentiment in later speeches in the following broadcast, stating, "In the socialist system, all effective and healthy opposition and the natural change of parties in office from time to time would necessarily come to an end, and a political police would be required to enforce an absolute and permanent system upon the nation." And yet again, in his next, "Under socialism, central government is to plan for all our lives and tell us exactly where we are to go and what we are to do, and any resistance to their commands will be punished." And that no change of government would be allowed under them because their executive, quote, "could not allow itself to be challenged or defeated at any time in any form of parliament they might allow." The level of tone deaf this was to the people of the nation cannot be understated. As to why. First, as Churchill's daughter Sarah has pointed out, the people had just seen how even in the worst of times, some of these so-called socialist ideals instituted by the Labour Party during the war kept things running relatively smoothly, regardless of the otherwise extreme circumstances. But there was another huge factor, which brings us back to the aforementioned empire-changing document, the Social Insurance and Allied Services Command 6404, aka the Beveridge Report, publishing in November of 1942, written by economist William Beveridge with contributions by his wife, mathematician Janet Beveridge. Among other things in the report, it proposed after the war the establishment of a national health service, social security, a number of full employment practices, and other similar measures, in all providing its citizens with a base support from the cradle to the grave for the benefit of all of society. So popular was this document that over 600,000 copies of it were sold, and its ideas disseminated, now unprecedented for what was, after all, just a government document on recommendations to help heal and rebuild the nation after the war. In essence, the people of the nation who just had their lives upended for years were seeking some security and a return to normalcy. And this report showed how this could be achieved quite quickly. They'd also just seen what the government could accomplish in war and how working together in this way and focusing money and efforts on the goal produced extraordinary results. So why not spend just a fraction of the money that the war cost on homefront improvements and stability? As one contemporary commentator stated, "We have shown in this war that we British don't always muddle through. We have shown we can organise superbly. Look at these invasions of the continent which have gone like clockwork. Look at the harbours we have built on those beaches. No excuse anymore for unemployment and slums and underfeeding. Using even half the energy and invention and pulling together of what we have done in this war, what is there we cannot do? We have virtually exploded the arguments of old fogies and better-notters who have said we cannot afford this and we must not do that. If we can do it in war, why can't we do it in peace?" Going back to Churchill and the Conservative Party's campaign messages, they didn't just not focus on these very real issues in the nation at the time and vilified the party that was, continued comparing them to Nazis, but also continued to press the message that just because Germany was defeated, the time for sacrifice and fighting abroad was still at hand, with Churchill stating, "5 years ago, I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and your untiring response brought us, in the end, victory over Germany. Today, we still have tears, not so many, thank God, but the conquest of Japan, hand in hand with our American allies, is a formidable undertaking which we must and will see through to the end." But he didn't just stop with Japan, stating, "And we must still look forward, alas, to blood and sweat. We have a terrific task ahead of us. We have a shattered world around us, and we must help to rebuild it. We must strive for a sane and just peace, which will save us all and our children from that constant fear of war. That is why I am asking today for the support of all men and women of goodwill. During the war, I rested my trust in the British people. Time after time, I warned them of the dangers ahead, and they never failed. Once again, now, today, I must tell you that, in spite of all our victories, a rough road lies ahead. What a shame it would be, and what a folly, to add to our load the bitter quarrels with which the extreme socialists are eager to convulse and exploit these critical years. For the sake of the country and of your own happiness, I call upon you to march with me under the banner of freedom towards the beacon lights of national prosperity and honour, which must ever be our guides. In contrast to a message still focused on sacrifice for matters abroad, Ali stated the Parliament of 1935 had a big Conservative majority, and the policy pursued by the Conservative government landed this country into war. It was due to the action of the Labour Party that this Conservative government resigned. Mr. Churchill, who had opposed his own party, formed an all-party government which successfully brought us to victory. Now, a new Parliament must be elected. The choice is between that same Conservative Party, which stands for private enterprise, private profit, and private interests, and the Labour Party, which demands that, in peace, as in war, the interests of the whole people should come before those of a section. Labour puts first things first. Security from war, food, houses, clothing, employment, leisure, and social security for all must come before the claims of the few for more rent, interest, and profit. We have shown that we can organise the resources of the country to win the war. We can do the same in peace. These contrasting messages were, indeed, at the heart of the two campaigns, with the Conservatives using slogans like "finish the job" in contrast to Labour's "let us face the future." On their future, Labour had a very defined plan for fixing the war-torn nation suffering from a massive housing crisis after all the bombings and a number of other extreme issues. Labour was promising to solve all of this, including full employment, in part by nationalising staple industries like coal, steel, railways, electricity, aviation, etc. They also proposed social security, healthcare for everyone, more workers' rights and affordable housing. What's more, once again, given how well they'd done at managing similar things on the home front during the war, the people believed they had the skills to do it. Going back to the Conservatives, while they did propose some things like improved housing and even a national healthcare system, the promises were vague and ill-defined, as well as emphasising letting the private sector, not the government, figure it out, and otherwise completely drowned out by the rest of their message of focusing abroad. With a nation sick of war and on the verge of bankruptcy, talk of continuation of the war indefinitely wasn't exactly popular as you might imagine. After all, at this point, nobody knew how much longer it would take to defeat Japan. The Allies had more or less defeated Nazi Germany a couple of years before Germany actually was forced to surrender. Further, another line in the Conservatives' campaign was to illustrate the potential threat the Soviets and communism held. On the whole, all of this seemingly giving the impression of a party bent on war indefinitely. And indeed, Churchill was extremely concerned about the Soviets, stating, "Without Germany, what will lie between the white snows of Russia and the white cliffs of Dover?" He also asked his military leaders to devise plans to counter the Soviets should they try to push further into Europe, as well as making plans to ally with Germany and the US against the communist threat. On top of this, as alluded to in Attlee's aforementioned speech, many were angry at the Conservative Party for their policy of appeasement before the war, which ultimately led to the disaster that followed. That Churchill had been leading the charge against such at the time didn't matter. His party was still deemed responsible. Thus, with the Conservative Party's perceived mismanagement of events leading up to World War II versus Attlee and the Labour Party's own extreme successes at managing domestic matters during the war within the coalition government, combined with the Conservative Party as a whole seeming to have no real hard plan that appealed to anyone for how things would be managed after the war, rather than continually pushing the spectre of fear of more wars, all along with the general consensus that the Conservative Party would win in a landslide because of Churchill's popularity, ultimately led to its rather stunning defeat. This is something that should have been easily predicted, even before the election, as polls had been showing for a few years that Labour, not the Conservatives, were leading the popular vote. And in fact, in February of 1945, polls showed that it wasn't even close, with an 18% lead by Labour over the Conservatives. However, as such polls at the time were something of a novelty, few took them very seriously. And so it was. In a landslide victory of 47.7% to Labour and 36% to Conservative, the largest swing from Conservative to Labour in the history of British general elections. Churchill was out, Attlee was in. Perhaps On this, neither Attlee nor his party had really thought they'd win either, and now that they had, they decided it was critical to give Attlee the boot. Thus, on the very day of victory, they told Attlee to wait to go to the king until they could elect a leader, even though publicly, up to this point, they had been putting Attlee forward as that leader throughout the election. Attlee was having none of it, stating, "You cannot win an election and then say the question of the premiership is open. If you are invited by the king to form a government, you don't say you cannot reply for 48 hours, you accept the commission, and you either bring it off successfully or you don't. And if you don't, you go back and you say you can't and advise the king to send for someone else." His party didn't agree, however, and continued to scheme. Once again, true to his nature, rather than bother to argue further, he simply took action. Unbeknownst to his party, Attlee left and accepted the king's invitation to the palace. Upon returning to his scheming party members' victory party, he told them what he'd done, and the matter mostly dropped from there. As to the meeting with the king, apparently none too pleased with the change, when Attlee arrived, they both at first stood in silence, staring at each other. As things became awkward, Attlee finally broke the silence, stating, "I've won the election." The king then brusquely stated, "I know, I heard it on the 6 o'clock news." What would follow during Attlee's reign were some of the most sweeping changes in British governing history, setting the table for many staples of the government and policy since, such as the National Health Service, expanding the 1944 Education Act, the National Insurance Act, which provides unemployment and sickness benefits, and spearheading building over 1 million new homes in England, Scotland, and Wales in the next 6 years to replace those lost during the war, despite material shortages. Further, with the focus more firmly on the home front rather than matters abroad, Attlee and his government's policies also very intentionally saw the acceleration of the end of the British Empire and decolonisation throughout the world. In all, his brief, only about half a decade run, ultimately defined much of British politics for the next few decades. Now, going back to Churchill, this wasn't his end. You see, while the defeat sent Churchill into one of his occasional depressive spirals, and when the king had offered him the Order of the Garter, he declined, stating that the people had already given him the Order of the Boot. But he ultimately accepted defeat cordially. When his physician quipped that the British people were ungrateful, Churchill reportedly replied, "I wouldn't call it that. They've had a very hard time." He would also state, "They are perfectly entitled to vote as they please. This is democracy. This is what we've been fighting for." And speaking of fighting, Churchill was still the leader of the opposition, and after Attlee and his government had done their thing and relative stability was restored, Churchill and the Conservatives managed to win in 1951, with the then 77 and ailing Churchill nonetheless once again resuming as Prime Minister despite a series of strokes preceding this. During office this time, he particularly focused on continuing to strengthen relations between the US and Britain as the best way to preserve peace in the face of the Soviet rise, as well as to attempt to negotiate an end to the Cold War. On the side, given all his work with the US during his time as leader, in 1963, John F. Kennedy would declare Churchill, by act of Congress, an honorary citizen of the United States, one of only 8 people in history to be given that honor. As for Attlee, he would continue to lead the Labour Party for a handful of years after his time as Prime Minister, before ultimately stepping down at the age of 72 in 1955. He was then elevated to Earl Attlee and took his place in the House of Lords, among other things notably helping to establish the Homosexuality Law Reform Society with the goal of decriminalising homosexual acts. On January 1st, 1959, troops of the revolutionary 26th of July movement marched into the Cuban capital of Havana, toppling the American-backed government of dictator Fulgencio Batista. 2 weeks later, the leader of the revolution, former lawyer Fidel Castro, was sworn in as prime minister. Almost immediately, Castro began implementing a program of sweeping socialist reforms, nationalizing Cuba's sugar and oil refining industries, confiscating land from private owners and redistributing it among the peasantry, and seeking closer diplomatic and economic ties with the Soviet Union. These actions incensed and frightened the United States, who saw the Caribbean island as a dangerous communist outpost in the Western Hemisphere. Over the next 6 decades, Cuba's beard-sporting, fatigues-wearing, cigar-chomping leader would remain a veritable obsession of the American CIA, attracting dozens of coup and assassination attempts. But while some of these plots were well-organized and came close to succeeding, others were so improbably absurd that they sound like something Wile E. Coyote would dream up after browsing the Acme Products catalog, involving such exotic killing methods as exploding seashells, poisoned diving suits, and LSD-laced cigars. This is the story of the many hilarious ways the CIA tried and failed to kill Fidel Castro.
The first recorded attempt to undermine the Cuban Revolution took place in early 1960, a year after the fall of the Batista government. According to former US Air Force Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who revealed the plot in 1975, the US Defense Department's Office of Special Operations chartered a small Air Force liaison aircraft to fly 2 CIA-trained Cuban exiles from Elgin Air Force Base in Florida to a road just outside of Havana. The exiles planned to infiltrate a building in Havana overlooking Castro's daily commute and assassinate the leader with a sniper rifle. But while the plane returned safely to Florida, the 2 operatives were never heard from again, likely having been captured by Cuban forces en route to Havana. Finding it increasingly difficult to infiltrate outside agents into Cuba, the CIA enlisted the help of a person with very close ties to Fidel Castro, his former mistress, Marita Lorenz. The German-born daughter of an ocean liner captain, Lorenz arrived in Havana in February 1959 and soon met and began an affair with the new Cuban leader, who immediately proceeded to knock her up. 7 months later, Lorenz was given a glass of drugged milk, passed out, and awoke in a local clinic with her baby nowhere to be found. Shortly thereafter, she was recruited by CIA agent Frank Sturgis, who gave her a package of poison capsules and convinced her to return to Cuba and kill her former lover. Unfortunately, the plan immediately went awry. Paranoid that the pills would be discovered by Cuban customs, Lorenz hid them in a pot of cold cream. Later, when she tried to recover them, they were all gunked up. I fished them out and flushed them down the bidet. Things only got worse when Castro finally appeared, as Lorenz later recalled. "Why did you leave so suddenly?" he asked. "Are you running around with those counter-revolutionaries in Miami?" I said yes. I tried to play it cool. The most nervous I've ever been was in that room because I had agents on standby and I had to watch my timing. I had enough hours to stay with him, order a meal, kill him, and prevent him from making a speech that night, which was already pre-announced. He was very tired and wanted to sleep. He was chewing on a cigar, and he laid down on the bed and said, "Did you come here to kill me?" Just like that, I was standing at the edge of the bed. I said, "Yes, I wanted to see you." And he said, "That's good, that's good." He asked if I was working for the CIA. I said, "Not really, I work for myself." Then he leaned over, pulled out his .45 and handed it to me. I flipped the chamber out and hit it back. He didn't even flinch. And he said, "You can't kill me. Nobody can kill me." And he kind of smiled and chewed on his cigar. I felt deflated. He was so sure of me. He just grabbed me. We made love. I contemplated staying to try talking to him later after his speech, but it would be too late because he rambles on for 8, 10, 12 hours. That was the hardest part. I wanted him to beg me to stay, but he got dressed and left. I just sat there by myself a while. I left him a note. I told him that I would be back. Shortly after this encounter, Lorenz left Cuba, only returning once to visit Castro in 1981. The CIA's next major assassination attempt targeted not Fidel Castro, but his younger brother Raul, then leader of the Cuban Armed Forces. In June 1960, Jose Raul Martinez, a pilot for National Airline Cubana and secret CIA operative, revealed that he had been chosen to fly Raul Castro to a meeting in Prague in the then Communist Republic of Czechoslovakia. Seizing a rare opportunity to eliminate a key figure in the Cuban government, the CIA wired $10,000 to William Murray, its operative in Havana, and instructed him to arrange for Castro to have an accident. The plot was a rush job in the extreme. Indeed, Murray's only chance to discuss the mission with Martinez was while the pilot was driving to the airport. And while Martinez was eager to eliminate Castro, he was unsure of how to do so without also killing everyone on the plane. In the end, he asked Murray, "If I die, will you make sure that my 2 sons have their college education paid for?" The CIA agreed, and Martinez set off on his mission. Minutes later, however, Murray received new orders. "Do not pursue. Would like to drop matter." But it was already too late. The plane had already taken off, and Murray had no means of contacting Martinez. In the end, however, Martinez found no opportunity to arrange the CIA's desired accident and returned Raul Castro to Cuba safe and sound. A few months later, Martinez defected to the United States. Just 1 month after this hastily organized assassination attempt, the CIA concocted a more sophisticated scheme to poison Fidel Castro by contaminating his favorite cigars with botulinum toxin, one of the most powerful poisons known to science. According to official records from the CIA's Technical Services Division, the poisoned cigars were ready by October 7, 1960, and delivered to an unidentified operative in Cuba on February 13, 1961. For unknown reasons, however, the cigars never made it into Castro's hands. At around the same time, the CIA also toyed with the idea of overthrowing Castro, not by assassinating him, but by undermining his credibility. One such scheme involved clandestinely dosing Castro with LSD or a similar hallucinogen prior to delivering a television or radio broadcast to make him behave erratically. Another plot, timed to coincide with a planned address before the United Nations in New York, involved poisoning Castro with thallium salts. The salts, which would be slipped into Castro's shoes when he sat them outside his hotel room to be polished, would, it was hoped, cause Castro's iconic beard to fall out, making him look weak on the world stage. In the end, however, neither plan was carried out. The next offensive against Cuba would be a much more substantial affair. In March of 1960, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized the CIA to arm and train a force of exiled counter-revolutionaries to land in Cuba and lead a coup against the Castro government. Though Eisenhower left office later that year, his successor, John F. Kennedy, gave the operation the go-ahead. On April 17, 1961, a force of 1,400 Cuban exiles, known as Brigade 2506, sailing from bases in Guatemala and Nicaragua, landed in the Bay of Pigs in southwest Cuba. The operation was a complete disaster. Due to confusion over time zones, the expected American air support came an hour late, and Brigade 2506 found itself pinned down on the beach by Cuban revolutionary forces. And when the world learned of the illegal invasion, President Kennedy cancelled further airstrikes. Within 2 days, 100 exiles were killed and the rest captured. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a major embarrassment for the Kennedy administration, further souring relations between the United States and Cuba. In late 1961, Fidel Castro officially declared himself a Marxist-Leninist and publicly sought closer cooperation with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In the wake of the Bay of Pigs disaster, the CIA and the Department of Defense launched Operation Mongoose, a multi-phase coordinated program of military and intelligence operations designed to undermine and topple the Cuban government. The plan, authorized by President Kennedy on November 30th, 1961, included the dissemination of anti-Castro propaganda, the training and infiltration of counter-revolutionary guerrilla units into the country, the assassination of key government figures, and, quote, all other political, economic, and covert actions short of inspiring a revolt in Cuba or developing the need for US armed intervention in order to help Cuba overthrow the communist regime while remaining consistent with US overt policy and remaining in position to disengage with minimum loss in assets and US prestige. Operation Mongoose was placed under the directorship of CIA operative Edward Lunsdale and given an initial budget of $100 million. Over the next 2 decades, the project would consume $50 million per year and involve some 2,500 Cuban and American personnel. In June 1962, American lawyer James B. Donovan, most famous for arranging the exchange of Soviet spy Rudolph Abel for CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers, was sent to Cuba to negotiate the release of 1,113 Cuban exiles taken prisoner during the Bay of Pigs invasion. In the lead-up to the mission, the CIA prepared a special scuba diving outfit, which Donovan was to present to Castro as a gift. The wetsuit had been treated with spores of the fungus Eumycetoma, which causes the disfiguring skin disease Madura foot, while the breathing apparatus was infected with tuberculosis bacteria. But in another stroke of bad luck, Donovan revealed that he had already gifted Castro with a diving suit, and the infected suit never left the United States. In the end, Donovan managed to secure the prisoner's release in exchange for $52 million in medical supplies and baby food. With their assets in Cuba swiftly dwindling, the CIA next turned to another group with a major grudge against Castro, the American Mafia. Prior to the revolution, the Mafia had enjoyed a lucrative presence in Cuba, running a chain of successful hotels, nightclubs, brothels, and casinos, catering mostly to American tourists. When Castro came to power, however, he seized the Mafia's assets and expelled them from the country. The CIA's collaboration with the Mafia had begun back in 1960, when the agency sent former FBI agent and private intelligence contractor Bob Maheu to make contact with Chicago mob bosses Johnny Rosselli, Salvatore Giancana, and Santos Trafficant. The mobsters eagerly agreed to cooperate, even waiving their regular fee to carry out the assassination. Despite this, Maheu soon dropped out of the plot, later stating, "I was not happy about the project in the first place. I felt that I was building up my business. I had a good business going. The demands on behalf of the Howard Hughes interests were increasing progressively. On the other hand, I felt that I had an obligation to my country, and I recognized the fact that the agency had been good to me in the early stages of my business. I was anxious to get back to work." My recollection is that I phased out of the project as soon as it could be accomplished after the Bay of Pigs or after the invasion was not successful. Rosselli, Giancana, and Trafficant, however, carried on plotting, and in 1963 they managed to smuggle a batch of botulinum toxin pills into Cuba disguised as a bottle of aspirin. The perfect opportunity to deploy them soon arrived when Castro visited the Havana Libre Hotel, which served his favorite chocolate milkshakes. Interestingly, Castro was such an ice cream aficionado that in 1966 he spearheaded the construction of Havana's famous Coppelia, a massive ice cream parlor which seated 1,000 guests and served a then impressive 26 different flavors. Yet, despite the mob having found the perfect delivery mechanism for Castro's poison, once again the plot quickly unraveled. When the would-be assassin went to retrieve the poisoned capsule from the freezer where he had hidden it, he found it frozen to the wall. His attempts to free the capsule caused it to rupture, scuppering the assassination attempt. Here was the closest they came to actually killing Fidel Castro. But this failure was not for lack of trying. For over the next decade, the agency would hatch a dizzying array of harebrained assassination schemes, each more outlandish than the next. One such plot involved planting a conch shell packed with explosives near a reef where Castro liked to scuba dive. The shell was even painted in bright colors to make it especially attractive. Other schemes involved blowing Castro's head off with exploding cigars, pushing him into a vat of molten metal while he toured a steel mill, injecting him with a poison-tipped needle disguised as a pen, shooting him with a gun hidden in a television camera, or killing him with a grenade disguised as a baseball, another of Castro's favorite pastimes. Of course, none of these attempts proved successful, and in 1976 the findings of the Church Committee, a US Senate group established to investigate abuses by the CIA, FBI, NSA, and IRS, prompted President Gerald Ford to pass a series of intelligence service reforms which, among other things, banned the assassination of foreign leaders. This effectively brought Operation Mongoose to an end. Like the Bay of Pigs invasion, Mongoose had turned into an embarrassing failure for the US government, swallowing countless millions of dollars while accomplishing little of substance. Meanwhile, the US government had found more effective ways of containing Cuban influence. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the United States imposed a complete trade embargo against Cuba. But while the CIA was no longer allowed to assassinate Castro directly, they continued to work with Cuban exiles and other anti-Castro forces. As recently as 2000, former CIA operative Luis Posada was arrested in Panama for planting explosives in a podium where Castro was scheduled to speak. Castro's security detail found and removed the explosives, and Castro's speech proceeded as planned. In 2004, Panamanian President Mireya Moscoso pardoned and released Posada, who subsequently fled to the United States. According to former Cuban intelligence officer Fabian Escalante, over his lifetime, Fidel Castro survived a whopping 638 assassination attempts. This number, however, is highly debated, with declassified CIA records confirming only 8 officially sanctioned plots. Nonetheless, Castro's apparent invulnerability became a part of his public image, with the leader once claiming that if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal. On another occasion, Castro was offered a Galapagos tortoise as a gift, but upon learning it would live for 100 years or more, he declined the offer, quipping, "That's the problem with pets. You get attached to them, and then they die on you." Indeed, for a man forever in the world's crosshairs, Castro lived an astonishingly long life, with the leader stating on his 90th birthday that, "Never would such an idea have occurred to me. It was not the fruit of any effort. It was the whim of fate. Soon I will be like all the rest." These words would prove to be prophetic, for 3 months later, on November the 25th, 2016, Fidel Castro finally died, not from an exploding cigar or a poison milkshake, but it was the killer that gets us all in the end: time. Deep beneath the al-Qura Mosque in Baghdad, locked away in a secret vault, is an object that can only be described as a theological paradox. An object so blasphemous, Islamic law dictates it must be destroyed, but so inherently holy that it can't be. This is the Blood Quran, a copy of the Islamic holy book written entirely in the blood of former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. The Blood Quran was commissioned by Saddam on April 28, 1998, on the occasion of his 61st birthday. The dictator had recently re-embraced his Islamic faith after his son Uday Hussein narrowly survived an assassination attempt on December 12, 1996. In an official letter published in 2000, Saddam explained that the book was intended as thanks to God for bringing him safely through many conspiracies and dangers throughout his long political career, stating, "My life has been full of dangers in which I should have lost a lot of blood, but since I have bled only a little, I asked somebody to write God's words with my blood in gratitude." To write the book, Saddam commissioned calligrapher Abbas Shakir Judi al-Baghdadi. Over the next 2 years, nursed through a total of 27 litres of Saddam's blood and delivered it to al-Baghdadi, who, after treating it with chemicals to stabilize it, used the liquid to write out the 114 chapters and 6,000 verses of the Islamic holy book, completed in 2000, the finished book runs 605 pages and is written in lettering 2 centimeters in height, with borders decorated in intricate blue, red, and black designs. The pages, mounted in gold-edged frames, were displayed in a dedicated pavilion in the heart of Baghdad's al-Ma'arik, or Mother of All Battles Mosque. The mosque, begun around the same time as the Blood Quran and completed in 2001, was built by Saddam to celebrate his supposed victory over coalition forces in the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, and features minarets designed to resemble Scud ballistic missiles and the barrels of Kalashnikov rifles. The pavilion housing the Quran pages was largely kept locked and only opened for special guests of Saddam. Right from the start, the Blood Quran set off storms of controversy among Islamic clerics. According to Islamic law, or Sharia, human blood is considered najis, or ritually unclean, and anything it touches is also rendered unclean. To write a Quran, the holy word of God, in blood is therefore especially forbidden, or haram. Abbas al-Baghdadi, the book's creator, was well aware of this, but could not refuse for fear of reprisals by the Saddam regime. In an interview in 2003, al-Baghdadi, who now lives in the US state of Virginia, stated, "I don't like to talk about this now. It was a painful part of my life that I want to forget about." Controversy also surrounds the total amount of blood Saddam contributed to the project and how much was actually used to write the book. In most parts of the world, the maximum amount of blood a person is allowed to donate in a year is between 5 and 6 units, or around 3 liters. At this rate, it would have taken Saddam nearly 9 years to donate 27 liters rather than only 2. This has led some to speculate that the blood came not from Saddam, but from an underling, or even from political prisoners. However, as the few eyewitness accounts of the actual process are wildly conflicting, this is a question that is unlikely to ever be answered. The Blood Quran remained on display until April 2003, when US forces captured Baghdad. As fighting enveloped the city, the mosque's caretakers removed the book from its pavilion and hid it away for safekeeping. Among them was Sheikh Samarai, who even hid pages in his own house. Samarai now serves as one of the primary caretakers of the Blood Quran, which is kept hidden away in a vault beneath the mosque, now renamed al-Qura, or Mother of All Cities, behind 3 sets of locked doors. As Samarai explained in 2010, "I knew this would be much sought after, and we made the decision to protect it. But to see this now is not easy. There are 3 keys, and none of them are held in the one place. I have one, the police chief in the area has another, and there is a third in another part of Baghdad. There has to be a decision of a committee to let you in." The Blood Quran is almost never shown to visitors, kept out of sight as clerics and politicians debate just what to do with it. While the method of its creation makes it unclean and blasphemous, the Blood Quran is nonetheless a Quran, and thus, according to Islamic tradition, cannot be defaced or destroyed. The book thus presents a serious theological quandary for Iraq. As Abdul Qahar al-Ani, professor of Islamic thought at Baghdad University, explains, Saddam is not a holy man, so his blood is dirty. But some of the scholars say it is okay because in one of his battles, Muhammad's warriors gave thanks for victory with the blood of the enemy on their clothes. I don't accept this. Such a book has never been written in the time since the Prophet, so why should Saddam do it? But there are no guidelines. Who among the scholars since would have thought it necessary to write rules for such a thing? But the Blood Quran is controversial not only theologically but politically as well, with many members of Iraq's current government fearing that it and other relics of the Saddam era could serve as rallying points for the Ba'ath Party revivalists and should therefore be destroyed. In the words of Ahmed Kalabi, former head of the National De-Ba'athification Commission, the best talent in Iraq was ordered to produce monuments which are designed to suppress the people. This is very destructive for the psyche of the Iraqi population. This is a clear reminder of the consequences of totalitarianism and idealizing a person that embodies evil. They have brought nothing to Iraq. They are not worth celebrating. They have nothing aesthetic to offer. I am for removing them. Others are not so certain, including Muaffaq al-Rabai, the former national security advisor who escorted Saddam to his execution in 2006. He was there, and he ruled, and he impacted on the world. But he was a part of our history. He was a bad part of our history, but he made a huge difference whether we liked it or not. We need not bury the legacy of that period. We need to remember it, all what is bad and what is good, and learn lessons. And the most important lesson is that dictatorship should not return to Iraq. Further complicating the issue is the burning down of the National Library and Archives in April, which destroyed huge swaths of Iraq's artistic and literary heritage and left the Blood Quran as one of the few remaining examples of native Islamic calligraphy. Sheikh Samarai, the book's caretaker, is rather more equivocal. It says a lot about Saddam. It should never be put in a museum, though, because no Iraqi wants to see it. Maybe in the future it could be sent to a private museum, like memorabilia from the the Hitler and Stalin regimes. In the meantime, as the debate rages on, the blood Quran remains hidden away behind its 3 locked doors, one of the most confusing and frustrating relics in the Islamic world, and among the strangest and most long-lived legacies of Saddam Hussein's 24-year rule over Iraq. Along with serving 2 terms as the President of the United States between 1901 and 1909, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt also had a laundry list of supremely manly escapades throughout his life, such as the time he was shot in the chest in an assassination attempt, but went ahead and gave a lengthy speech it planned anyway before seeking medical attention. You can see our video on that subject linked to below. Another such story he was often fond of telling came from his brief stint as a deputy sheriff for Billings County, North Dakota. Originally, Roosevelt only traveled to what were then the Badlands of North Dakota to hunt buffalo in 1883, but the future president became so enamored with frontier life and the beauty of the natural landscape that he decided to build himself a log cabin, buy a few cows, and tend to the herd as a way of escaping the monotony of everyday life in New York City. Since we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt, a man who never did anything halfway, when we say he bought a few cows to serve his new hobby of ranching, we of course mean he bought several hundred of them. These cows were left under the care of the Chimney Butte Ranch, of which Roosevelt bought a considerable stake. Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, reportedly loved being a cowboy, and he threw himself into any and every job the ranch required whenever he visited. When Roosevelt casually bought a few hundred more cows a year later in 1884, he established the Elkhorn Ranch so that he'd have a place to store them all. As for why Roosevelt doubled down on his little ranching hobby, it is believed that it was as the result of the fact that Roosevelt's wife, Alice, died of undiagnosed kidney failure shortly after giving birth to their daughter Alice in 1884. This was on the same day and in the same house that his mother died of typhoid fever just 11 hours earlier. In response, he simply put a giant X in his journal and wrote one sentence: "The light has gone out of my life." Perhaps seeking escapism, Elkhorn Ranch was born. It was during his tenure as a rancher that Roosevelt also decided to try his grizzled hand at being a lawman, and although the post of deputy sheriff didn't offer any pay save for remuneration on any travel costs incurred while on duty and a small stipend for any arrests made, Roosevelt nonetheless dedicated himself to the job with the trademark go-getting, no-nonsense attitude that would later become synonymous with his presidency. In particular, Roosevelt felt he had a moral duty to ensure criminals should receive a fair trial at the hands of the law, and he was absolutely dogged in his determination when it came to pursuing those who'd committed any act of wrongdoing, something he was only too happy to prove in March of 1886 when he was informed that the only boat on his ranch, and for many miles around, had been stolen. The boat in question was what Roosevelt used to cross the Little Missouri River to hunt and to tend his cattle. According to Roosevelt, "We had no doubt as to who had stolen it, for whoever had done so had certainly gone down the river in it, and the only other thing in the shape of a boat on the Little Missouri was a small flat-bottomed scow in the possession of 3 hard characters who lived in a shack or hut some 20 miles above us, and whom we had shrewdly suspected for some time of wishing to get out of the country, as certain of the cattlemen had begun to openly threaten to lynch them. They belonged to a class that always holds sway during the raw youth of a frontier community, and the putting down of which is the first step toward decent government." The thieves, who were described by Roosevelt as a well-built fellow named Michael Finnegan, a half-breed stout muscular man called Bernstead, and an old German whose viciousness was of the weak and shiftless type called Pfaffenbach. They had each been implemented in a number of crimes, including cattle rustling, murder, and, oddly less forgivably at the time, horse theft. The thieves had apparently stumbled upon Roosevelt's boat while absconding from a nearby crime scene, reasoning that nobody could follow them down the river, which was currently almost impassable due to a combination of storm and severely icy weather, resulting in much of the river being frozen. Although the boat itself was of relatively little value, being only worth about $30, about $750 today, and the weather was dangerously bad, Roosevelt felt that by not pursuing the thieves, he would be ignoring his moral obligation as a lawman to pursue any criminal. Further, he reasoned, in any wild country where the power of law is little felt or heeded and where everyone has to rely upon himself for protection, men soon get to feel that it is in the highest degree unwise to submit to any wrong, no matter what cost of risk or trouble. To submit tamely and meekly to theft or to any other injury is to invite almost certain repetition repetition of the offense in a place where self-reliant hardihood and the ability to hold one's own under all circumstances rank as the first of virtues. So, as soon as he became aware of the theft, he called on his two most trusted ranch hands, Bill Sewell and Wilmot Dow, and informed them that they were going to hunt the thieves down. A bold claim, considering the thieves had stolen his only viable means of transport for such an endeavor, and that the ranch was currently in the middle of an icy storm that had killed 60% of the cows that Roosevelt owned. Catching up to the thieves on horseback in that weather, it simply wasn't an option. Roosevelt and his companions, they spent the next 3 days building themselves a brand new boat with which to pursue the thieves down the icy river. Yep, Roosevelt built himself a new boat just to track down and arrest the men who'd stolen his other boat, even though it would be at great risk to his own life from the combination of the weather, potentially hostile Native Americans in the region, and that the men he were hunting were well armed and would have little qualms about simply shooting him and leaving his body where no one would ever find it. Using his skills as an expert hunter, Roosevelt was able to easily track the thieves downriver to find their camp, which he happened to stumble upon while two of the thieves were gone hunting. Given that the thieves had not expected any pursuit, having stolen the only boat for many miles around, and that catching up by horse in that weather would have been impossible, they were lax, allowing his group to easily ambush the third member of the posse. As Roosevelt said, the only one in the camp was the German, whose weapons were on the ground, and who, of course, gave up at once. They then made him safe, delegating one of our number to look after him particularly and see that he made no noise, and then sat down and waited for the others. The camp was under the lee of a cut bank behind which we crouched, and after waiting an hour or over, the men we were after came in. We heard them a long way off and made ready, watching them for some minutes as they walked towards us, their rifles on their shoulders and the sunlight glinting on the steel barrels. When they were within 20 yards or so, we straightened up from behind the bank, covering them with our cocked rifles, while I shouted to them to hold up their hands, an order that, in such a case, in the West, a man is not apt to disregard if he thinks the giver is in earnest. The half-breed obeyed at once, his knees trembling for a second, his eyes fairly wolfish. Then, as I walked up within a few paces, covering the center of his chest so as to avoid overshooting and repeating the command, he saw that he had no show, and, with an oath, let his rifle drop and held his hands up beside his head. Rather than shooting or hanging the men on the spot, which was entirely within his rights to do, Roosevelt vowed that each man would receive a fair trial. Originally, Roosevelt's group had planned to float down the river with the thieves to the nearest town, Dickinson. Going upriver wasn't an option with the swift currents, but the plan soon had to be abandoned as the river was simply too frozen over for the journey to be completed. At first, they thought to wait it out to see if the ice would break up enough to allow for travel. Roosevelt noted, "The next 8 days were as irksome and monotonous as any I ever spent. There is very little amusement in combining the functions of a sheriff with those of an Arctic explorer. The weather kept as cold as ever. We had to be additionally cautious on account of being in the Indian country, having worked down past the Killdeer Mountains, where some of my cowboys had run across a band of Sioux, said to be the Tetons, the year before. Very probably the Indians would not have harmed us anyhow, but as we were hampered by the prisoners, we preferred not meeting them, nor did we, though we saw plenty of fresh signs and found, to our sorrow, that they had just made a grand hunt all down the river and had killed or driven off almost every head of game in the country through which we were passing. Low on supplies, they decided to split up, with Roosevelt breaking off from the group so he could personally escort all 3 prisoners to the nearest town, on foot, before they ran out of food. Since he was the only member of his party left, Roosevelt didn't sleep for the duration of the almost 40-hour journey across the partially frozen, occasionally ankle-deep sludge, reportedly keeping himself awake at night by reading Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, while still pointing a shotgun at his prisoners so they couldn't sneak away or kill him and then be happily on their way. What makes this more impressive is that none of the prisoners were cuffed or bound in any way during their transport. You see, the weather was so cold that Roosevelt was worried they would succumb to frostbite if he tied them up at night, so he simply decided to keep ever vigilant while escorting the 3 prisoners, who were no doubt looking for any opportunity to overpower their lone captor on the last stretch of the journey. After traveling from the start some 300 or so miles across the roughest terrain imaginable in bitterly cold weather, Roosevelt was, to quote, "most heartily glad when we were at last jolted into the long, straggling main street of Dickinson, and I was able to give my unwilling companions into the hands of the sheriff. Under the laws of Dakota, I received my fees as a deputy sheriff for making the 3 arrests, and also mileage for the 300-odd miles gone over, a total of some $50. It should also be noted that by choosing to not just shoot the prisoners on the spot when he found them, as he was well within his rights to do, and what many lawmen in the same scenario probably would have done at the time, Roosevelt gained the begrudging respect of the gang's ringleader, who later wrote to Roosevelt from prison thanking him for being such a peerless sentinel of justice. Roosevelt similarly refused to press charges against Pfaffenbach, stating that he simply didn't have enough sense to do anything good or bad, something Pfaffenbach was only too keen to thank Roosevelt for as well. Roosevelt would later go on to write about this escapade in one of his many excellent books, Ranch Life and The Hunting Trail. And now for some bonus facts. After graduating college, Roosevelt saw a doctor about his frequent heart problems. The doctor recommended that Roosevelt seek a career behind a desk and avoid any strenuous activities in his life. Roosevelt obviously did not heed this recommendation, regularly boxing, playing tennis, hiking, rowing, playing polo, horseback riding, among various other exercises. This actually probably helped extend his life rather than shorten it, though he did eventually die of heart failure. He also went blind in one eye thanks to boxing several times a week, and in one instance had his retina detach after a punch to the eye. After that happened, he decided to stop boxing and took up judo, earning a third-degree brown belt. When he wasn't doing all of that, Roosevelt frequently liked to skinny dip in the Potomac River, even in the winter. And now for another bonus fact. Being the daughter of perhaps one of the manliest men of all time, Roosevelt's daughter Alice was known for her unladylike habits of smoking, gambling, promiscuity, late-night parties, and keeping a pet snake. She also reportedly had a quick wit and was fond of constant rule-breaking. Roosevelt once commented on his daughter's frequent practice of interrupting state meetings to speak with him, saying, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." Among her many escapades, when the Roosevelts moved out of the White House, Alice buried a voodoo doll of the new president's wife, Nellie Taft, in the front yard. Alice's lone child, Paulina Longworth, was also actually not from her husband, Nick Longworth, but the daughter of Senator William Borah, who she had a long-lasting affair with. Nick Longworth himself may have had children by women not Alice, as he was known to have had numerous affairs throughout their marriage, which had become an unhappy one after Alice had campaigned against him. And now for another bonus fact. Unlike many of his era, Roosevelt was a strong supporter of black American rights, including being the first president to invite a black man to have dinner at the White House, Booker T. Washington. At this point, Roosevelt invited Washington over to dinner on October 16, 1901. News of the controversial dinner traveled along the Associated Press wires throughout the night. The morning newspapers were generally positive in the North, but many Southern papers took a different tact. They proceeded to attack both Roosevelt and Washington with fervor. For instance, the next afternoon, the Memphis Scimitar reported, "The most damnable outrage which has ever been perpetrated by a citizen of the United States was committed by the president when he invited a N-word to dine with him at the White House. It would not be worth more than a passing notice if Theodore Roosevelt had sat down to dinner on his own time with a Pullman car porter, but Roosevelt the individual and Roosevelt the president are not to be viewed in the same light." A U.S. Senator from South Carolina, Ben Tillman, proposed a retaliatory measure. The action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that N-word will necessitate our killing 1,000 N-words in the South before they will reach their place again. Soon after the dinner, Roosevelt received an honorary doctorate from Yale University, along with famous novelist Mark Twain. Booker T. Washington was also present at this event. Roosevelt spoke to Twain and asked the novelist for his opinion on the controversial matter. Twain replied that a president was perhaps not as free as an ordinary citizen to entertain whoever he likes. A few days later, Roosevelt made a public statement about the infamous dinner. True to his no-nonsense style, he simply said, "I shall have him to dine as often as I please." As for his general opinion of black Americans, Roosevelt would sum up his thoughts as such. "The only wise and honorable and Christian thing to do is treat each black man and each white man strictly on his merits as a man, giving him no more and no less than he shows himself worthy to have." And now for another bonus fact. As you might imagine, for much of his adult life, Roosevelt was incredibly strong thanks to a regular regimen of heavy exercise. However, towards the end of his life, he did for a time become obese after being shot in the chest. The bullet was in too deep to get out safely, so it was left in, causing him considerable pain for the rest of his life and stopping him from being able to do many of his normal exercises. But he continued to eat at the same rate he did when he did those exercises, causing him to gain considerable weight. He did lose a good amount of this fat while on his famous River of Doubt expedition, where he lost 55 pounds after becoming severely ill with infection and tropical fever. Roosevelt injured his leg on the River of Doubt expedition after jumping from his own boat and attempting to stop with his own strength two of his crewmen's boats from crashing into the rocks. This leg injury became infected, and he soon contracted tropical fever. He attempted to get the rest of his expedition to leave him to die on several occasions, but they refused, despite his illness drastically slowing their progress. He needed constant medical attention and was often delirious. He never quite recovered from this, with the last decade of his life having frequent flare-ups of leg inflammation and various sicknesses as a result, as well as dealing with the pains from the bullet that was lodged in his chest.
While Joseph Stalin's cult of personality, subsequent statues, and certain photos and paintings may have you thinking he was a giant of a man, in truth, the former Soviet leader and glorious moustache owner was only around 5 feet 5 inches tall. That's 165 centimeters, give or take an inch. While this is decidedly below average in many regions of the world for men today, in his own time it wasn't quite as much so, with the average height of a man in Russia as Stalin ventured into adulthood only ringing in at just under 5 feet 8 inches, that's 173 centimeters tall. Despite only being a little below average, Stalin went to some rather extreme lengths to hide his true stature, as well as other less literal shortcomings from the general public. Stalin's propensity to try and make himself appear taller was no doubt spurred on by comments such as the one by United States President Harry Truman. Truman, who was approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, referred to Stalin as a little squirt. Likewise, Grigol Ratadze, a man who was imprisoned alongside Stalin during his time as a revolutionary, described him as an unassuming man with a creeping way of walking, taking short steps. A former Yugoslavian politician mentioned that he was small with an ungainly build in a later book that described their encounters. Along with his below-average stature, Stalin's left arm was slightly shorter than his right, with a slightly withered hand due to an injury that he sustained at the age of 12 when he was hit by a horse and ultimately suffered severe blood poisoning. Although Stalin retained most of the use of his left arm throughout his life, it was noticeably more stiff and clumsy than his preferred appendage, and he was reportedly unable to fully extend his elbow from that age onwards. He mostly hid this injury by folding his hands over one another when taking photographs or by putting his left hand into his pocket. On top of this, Stalin's face was covered in pockmarks from a bout of near-fatal smallpox that he contracted at age 7, which he hid in later life with, among other methods, his gloriously maintained facial hair. Despite all of this, Stalin's cult of personality painted a very different picture, as did the actual artists who painted him. Presumably because of the fact that displeasing Stalin at the height of his power was a great way to find yourself no longer breathing, and possibly even erased from all records, which is something that we're going to get into shortly. Nearly every official photo, painting, and sculpture of the Father of Nations depicts him as being a man of gigantic size who towered over his subordinates. Stalin also insisted that Mikhail Gelovany, an actor given Stalin's personal blessing to perform as him in films and other propaganda, should not accept roles that would require him to portray a mere mortal because of how similar in appearance the two men were. It should be noted here, however, that Gelovany was reportedly much taller. To maintain this illusion in face-to-face meetings, Stalin also took to wearing boots with cleverly masked, significantly raised heels, and would often pose for photos while standing on a raised platform. Of course, few of Stalin's subordinates would ever dare to make fun of Stalin's penchant for trying to look taller, and the propaganda machine continually depicting him as having characteristics akin to those of a god, according to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, no doubt helped them rationalize Stalin's need to maintain the image. However, the same cannot be said for the likes of President Truman and Winston Churchill, who both found the length Stalin went to make himself appear taller rather amusing when they met with him. And lest you think Truman was trying to be insulting with the little squirt quip, he also had a lot of positive things to say about Stalin after their 1945 meeting, including writing in his diary on July the 17th that he, Stalin, is honest but smart as hell. Besides the high heels, the platforms in photographs, and exaggerated stature in paintings, Stalin's private residence in Sochi was specially constructed with his frame in mind, and everything in it, from the chairs to the staircase, was made slightly smaller than usual so that Stalin could use them perfectly comfortably and otherwise appear especially tall in stature.
Even his pool was only a little over 4 feet deep at its maximum depth because he couldn't swim. He did, however, enjoy taking little walks back and forth in it, and he didn't want to be submerged if he ventured into the deep end. Other features of Stalin's mansion, which you can still tour today, include a smaller than regulation-sized billiards table, complete with a smaller than average weighted cue that the dictator used to make his shots more powerful. Not that he needed it, because once in power, Stalin reportedly never lost a single game of billiards against any one of his guards. And it wouldn't be a crazy guess here to think that this probably had something to do with the fact that Stalin could have any of his guards killed if they simply displeased him. And now for some bonus facts. Beyond having numerous people killed for various reasons, Stalin was also famous for erasing any record of people that he didn't like from photos and official documents, a practice the ancient Romans referred to as damnatio memoriae. An example of this is shown in the picture we're showing here. The disappearing man here is Nikolai Yezhkov, one-time very powerful head of the NKVD. This is the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. In his post there, he presided over numerous tortures and mass executions during the Great Purge. But he later fell out of favor and himself was tortured until he admitted being a traitor. After this, he was purged himself. Once this happened, he became the Vanishing Commissar, with records of him, including photographs, suddenly disappearing. This was no small feat given the high-profile position that Yezhkov had previously held and the lack of Photoshop. And now for another bonus fact. After his presidency, Truman returned to his home in Missouri, with his only income being his old army pension. This was about $112.56 per month, which is about $982 today. Largely in response to his somewhat impoverished situation, Congress later passed the Former President's Act to give U.S. presidents pensions. Truman had numerous offers from large corporations for work, but turned them all down, stating, "I knew they were not interested in hiring Harry Truman the person, but what they wanted to hire was the former President of the United States. I could never lend myself to any transaction, however respectable, that would commercialize on the prestige and the dignity of the office of the presidency." And now for another bonus fact. Another famed leader who is equally famous for being short of stature, Napoleon Bonaparte, actually wasn't, at least by the standards of the day. The myth that he was short stems primarily from the fact that he is listed as 5 feet 2 inches tall at the time of his death. However, this is 5 feet 2 inches in French units. In modern international units, he was just shy of 5 feet 7 inches. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking, well, that's still pretty short for a man. Now, this is certainly true by modern standards in certain parts of the world, such as the United States. However, at the time in France, the average height for an adult male was about 5 feet 5 inches. So in fact, Napoleon was actually above average in height for his day. Despite this fact, Napoleon is primarily remembered for two things: being a master tactician and being short. The so-called Napoleon complex, named after him, describes men who have an inferiority complex, or more aptly, short man syndrome.
It's good to be the emperor, right? You can do emperor stuff and have fun all day long with everyone catering to your every whim. If you, too, would like to be an emperor, congratulations. You can click on the link below and bid on the title of Emperor of Rome. This is, translated into modern terms, what piqued the attention of Didius Julianus, the protagonist of our story today, who, on a fine evening of March the 28th, 193 AD, decided to participate in the weirdest event seen in Rome yet, and Rome had seen many. The bidding for the role of emperor. Chance for a life of epicness, right? Well, let's say winning the bid was the second worst thing to ever happen to Didius, the first thing, of course, being called Didius. To unravel this peculiar story, we must first go back to March the 28th, 193, and a little background leading up to it. To begin with, Commodus, yes, that Commodus, the problematic emperor, also known as Joaquin Phoenix, does not seem to have been killed by a former general turned gladiator in the arena, but was rather strangled in the bath by his wrestling partner in a plot led by Latus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Latus, however, knew how the game was played. You only kill an emperor if you already have a replacement in place ready to step up and prevent chaos and revenge tendencies. Multiple examples from the past, such as the killing of Julius Caesar, had shown that if they didn't have a solid plan as to who would follow, it did not bode well for the plotters. The replacement Latus had in mind was a well-established politician and military commander by the name of Pertinax, and in order to get the rest of the Praetorian Guard on board with the plan and to ensure the easy transition after Commodus had been murdered, Latus promised a huge gift or donative in the name of the new emperor, without clearing it with Pertinax first. The issue would bring Pertinax at odds with the Praetorian Guard. A staunch, honor-bound person, he did not speak the same language as the Praetorian Guard did. He expected that his soldiers would follow orders. They were not to be negotiated with, period. An indication of how unaccustomed the Praetorians were to harsh discipline is that they needed to be bribed by their commander-in-chief in the first place. And then there is the undeniable fact that from the get-go, they were somewhat skeptical about the rise of Pertinax. Unlike most of, well, everybody, the Praetorian Guard was actually quite happy under Commodus. He lived the high life as a gladiator, leading the empire to ruin, sure, but the Praetorian Guard had it pretty easy. They did not guard the Rhine in some cold and soggy province in the north. They lived in Rome, in the so-called Casa Praetoria, at a privileged spot east of the top of Quirinal Hill, not very far from the Termini station in Rome today. When on duty guarding the palace, they could enjoy the debaucheries of Commodus firsthand. It was not just the most honoured position in the military, but also the most coveted for its financial benefits and prestige. Now this staunch old man was drilling them as if they were some kind of common provincial soldiers, and on top of everything, he denied them their promised payment in full. So, in the afternoon of March the 28th, 193 AD, a bunch of them, 200 according to the historian Cassius Dio, marched to the living quarters of Pertinax. The poor emperor sent his ally, the Praetorian prefect Laetus, to calm his soldiers, but when Laetus saw them, he thought it very wise, as a head-saving strategy, to accompany them instead. Soon afterwards, and in fact not long at all after having been proclaimed head of state, the disciplinarian emperor lay dead. He was 66 years old, and the demise of this all-in-all honourable person was caused by nothing else than a lack of skills when it comes to reading the room. In Machiavelli's The Prince, Pertinax would go on to serve as an example of how a prince can easily be hated for good qualities. Laetus, seemingly assuming his role as an officer, stated the obvious. Killing the emperor is one thing, not having a replacement on the other hand can be really dangerous, especially since the military commander Pertinax was loved by the common soldiers who could seek revenge. It wasn't as if this sort of thing hadn't happened before. In principle, they didn't care who would become emperor. What they wanted, and that was the reason they clashed with Pertinax in the first place, was the payment due. So they thought of a splendid idea which would be frowned upon by contemporaries: an auction. Yep, the idea was to give the title of emperor to the highest bidder. Rome, of course, descended directly into turmoil. An emperor was always either the son of an emperor, be it adopted or by blood, or he had won the empire fair and square in the field of battle. But buying it, for the honor-bound ancient world, this was unimaginable. The first to begin bidding was a certain Sulpicianus, who was serving as prefect of Rome, kind of like a mayor. He had conveniently arrived at the Praetorian camp so that he could calm the situation, but really he began bidding. Enter Marcus Didius Julianus. Sweet Didius was well connected, but rather the silent type. As a favourite of the mother of Marcus Aurelius, many doors were opened for him, and he had served in some important positions, such as senator and governor of the province of Upper Germany. And there he had enjoyed successes against invading Germanic tribes, which led him to become co-consul, coincidentally with Pertinax in 175. In the coming years, he seemed content with smaller, rather relaxed positions such as in Bithynia, modern northwest Turkey, and North Africa. After that, he returned to Rome, enjoying a calm life. During supper on an uneventful day, the news came. The emperor was dead and the title was up for auction. Tradition dictates that although initially uninterested, his wife and daughter nagged him until he decided to enter the race. But as tradition was often written by biased misogynists, this tale could be a classic example of the popular women behind all evil trope, the type of thing with the apple. Whatever the case, Didius did end up wanting to win, so he went to the camp of the Praetorians. It is unclear what the situation with the other bidders was, but at the end there was only Didius who was standing outside the camp, as the soldiers did not let him in, with Sulpicianus inside the camp, who, by the way, was Didius's father-in-law. The soldiers arranged it thus that one would declare his bid, and then they would run to the fence and shout it to the other participants. This went on for a while, with the enthusiasm of the Praetorians rising with each bid. After hours, the amount rose to unimaginable heights. The final offer of Sulpicianus was 20,000 sestertii for each Praetorian soldier. For context, the yearly salary of a simple soldier was something below 2,000 sestertii. After hearing this from the fence, Didius, in a panic move, offered 25,000 per person, to which his father-in-law remained silent, and he had won. To be fair, Didius did show elements of a decent personality, as the first thing he asked as the winner of this weird auction was that the Praetorians spare the life of his rival. This was quite unusual, as normally when there was more than one candidate for the diadem, only the winner survived. In ancient Rome, the known axiom was the rule: in the Game of Thrones, you either win or die. die. After this event, the satisfied Praetorians accompanied their candidate for emperor to the Senate, the institution that could ratify the outcome of this farce. Because the senators knew better than to piss off the Praetorian Guard, they just kind of went along with it. And so it was Didius ruled happily ever after, gloriously leading the empire for 66 whole days. From the get-go, Didius was by most accounts one of the most unpopular emperors ever, mainly due to how he came to power, but also because his first action as emperor was devaluing the currency so that he could pay off the Praetorian Guard. Commodus might have been weird and kind of a clown, but he was also entertaining for the masses. Didius, however, was an embarrassment. As the main sources such as Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta inform us, people were openly mocking and laughing at him whenever he appeared in public, even throwing stones to block his path. Didius's polite gesture of demanding that his co-bidder and father-in-law Sulpicianus be spared was seen as a weakness, adding to his image as a puppet. Outside of Rome, the troops were unamused. 3 different armies rebelled at once, each hailing their commander and emperor. The one closest to Rome was Septimius Severus, who immediately began the march on the city. Didius tried to quickly drill the Praetorians, but their lavish lifestyle and fancy swords had no hope of standing a chance against trained field soldiers. After a few exchanges and some skirmishes, it became clear that even the huge amount of money wasn't worth their life, so they abandoned their chosen emperor en masse, leaving Didius unprotected. Even his former colleagues in the Senate deserted him. Not only did they proclaim Septimius Severus to be the rightful emperor, but they sentenced Didius Julianus to death. And so it was noted in Historia Augusta, finally it was proposed that the imperial power be taken away from Julianus by order of the Senate. This was done, and Severus was forthwith acclaimed emperor, while it was given out that Julianus had taken poison. Nevertheless, the Senate dispatched a delegation, and through their efforts, Didius was slain in the palace by a common soldier while beseeching the protection of Caesar, that is to say, Severus. His last words are said to have been, from the history of Cassius Dio, "What evil I have done, whom have I killed?" All in all, this guy seems not to have been a bad fellow. According to Historia Augustus, he was very affable at banquets, very courteous in the manner of petitions, and very reasonable in the matter of granting liberty. That's from Historia Augusta. And seeing as his reign began and ended without much support and was too short to make much of an impact on the further history of the empire, it is impossible to say what his leadership might have looked like in other circumstances. Judging by some of the emperors, both in his past and still to follow, he probably wouldn't have been the worst. But buying the title emperor, and with money that he didn't have, and with the armies near Rome, well, what was he thinking? But something good for him now. Ironically, it has to do with the thing that dragged him into the whole debacle, namely coin. Coins of the emperor Didius Julianus are prized by coin collectors, but are also important to archaeologists. Since he ruled for such a gloriously short time, any coins minted during his reign are relatively rare. Furthermore, they are dated with an accuracy archaeologists only vaguely dream of. You will notice that in museums, ancient objects are sometimes dated very vaguely, like a cup of the 5th to 6th century, or if you are lucky, you get something like late 5th century. The reason is that objects rarely give a specific date, let alone the month. The coins do often bear the year they were minted in, but this is also partially unreliable. The key here is continuity. A long-lived king would issue many coins, and if he belonged to a dynasty, those coins would continue circulating long after his death. But an emperor who ruled for only 66 days, first of all, his coins will be rare. Second, the dating can be relatively precise, as they were possibly not circulated after his death, also given the various monetary reforms that followed. If found by archaeologists amidst a collapsed living room, they almost have the exact date, spring to midsummer of the year 193 AD, and this will help date the various items that the coin was found with. And since we are at the subject of coin, time to talk about a bit of propaganda and once more feel some sympathy for Didius. The kind of imagery put on the coins was very carefully chosen, as in a world without press and TV, it was the most widely spread mass medium with which the political agenda would have been propagated on one side and the emperor's face on the other, the aptly named head side. So Augustus would have shown on the tail side a crocodile with the sign Egypto Capta, Egypt captured, to declare his victory over Egypt. Other coins would show personifications of victory or Rome or clemency, referring to various achievements of the emperor in question. Didius, however, had nothing to boast about. Some coins of Didius show the horn of Almathea or cornucopia. It is the magical horn of plenty, traditionally held by Fortuna, the goddess of luck. It could be an indication of the hope that he could find the money he needed for the payments, and with some luck, all would be fine, and he could figure out a way to bring his people to prosperity and plentiness, but, well, alas. subject of what a political leader in a democracy does after his term has ended and the merits of gracefully resigning from power has been on the news recently. Enter the subject of today's story, which takes place in ancient Rome at the dawn of the Republic era. The person in question was Cincinnatus, whose actions in terms of political ethics not only shaped the political life of generations to come, but was linked with the essence of what democratical thinking is, so much so that founders of the American nation dubbed Washington with Cincinnatus's name. So who was Cincinnatus, and what made him rather unique compared to the vast majority of his political leader compatriots throughout history? Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus was born to the noble house of Quinti, possibly around 519 BC, during the last years of the Kingdom of Rome. This means he belonged to the first generation to be raised within the just recently established grand experiment that was the Roman Republic. In the 460s, Rome was in turmoil, with the main issue being the representation of the plebeians in government, those of its citizens not born to noble families. At one of the violent clashes, one of two serving consuls, Publius Valerius Publicola, was killed. Cincinnatus rose to his position as a replacement via a system vaguely similar to how a vice president can replace the president in the United States. Cincinnatus therefore served a term in the highest political office in Rome. Ultimately, however, rather than trying to cling to power like so many others, he eventually chose to return to his private life. This was at the least unusual for various reasons. For one thing, he did not step down because he was fed up with politics. Far from it, he was highly opinionated regarding the issues of his day, with a strong stance against the plebeian demands for constitutional changes that would allow them to circumscribe the decisions of the consuls. Furthermore, he was in a very difficult financial situation because of a fine he had to pay on account of his son Caeso, who, after causing political turmoil and violence, left the city before the court had reached a sentence. In the end, Cincinnatus had to pay a rather large fine in his stead, for which he had to sell his estate and instead live on a small farm across the Tiber. Thus, by stepping away, he not only gave up incredible power, but was also returning to the life not so much as a wealthy noble as he had been before his term in office, but rather the life of a simple farmer. While all of this did nothing to advance his personal fortunes, his choice not to use his term as consul as a means to broaden his political career, change his economic fortune, or even to recall his son, whom the Republic had condemned, gained him the respect of fellow Romans. But the story of Cincinnatus was just beginning. 2 years later, around 458 BC, Rome was once again in peril as the army of the neighboring nation of Aequi broke towards Rome, defeating one consular army while the other was far from the action. To respond to this imminent threat, the Senate decided to elect a dictator, which at that time was a title provided by the Senate to a person who would have king-like powers for a fixed term, 6 months, after which the power would be returned to the Senate. This enabled the appointed dictator to act swiftly without asking for permission or waiting for the conclusion of further and often extended senatorial debates. Naturally, the person chosen for this role had to not only be eminently capable, but also trusted to actually step away when the term was finished. Thus, for this role, the Senate chose Cincinnatus. The historian Livy illustrates the scene. A group of senators approached the farm where Cincinnatus was working. He greeted them and asked if everything was in order. "It might turn out well for both you and your country," they replied, and they asked him to wear his senatorial toga before they spoke further. After he donned the garb of the office, they informed him of the Senate's mandate, hailed him as dictator, and took him with them back to Rome. Cincinnatus then got right to work mobilizing the army, besieging the enemy at the Battle of Mount Algidus, and returning victorious to Rome, all in the span of 2 weeks. After this huge success, all possible political exploits could have been available to him, especially as he was constitutionally allowed to stay in power for 5.5 more months. Despite this, upon his return, he immediately abdicated and returned to his farm. The task at hand was complete, thus he saw no reason power shouldn't be returned to the Senate. Twice, he could have used his position for his own gain, and twice he had not only chosen not to, but stepped away when his work was complete. But this isn't the end of Cincinnatus's tale. 19 years later, in 439 BC, Cincinnatus was around 80 years old and once again asked to become dictator, this time to deal with inner political intrigue, as a certain Malleus was using his money to try and be crowned king, the ultimate threat against any republic. The episode ended with the death of the would-be king, and again, his work done, Cincinnatus resigned after having served less than a month as dictator in this instance. As you might expect from all of this, these practically unprecedented actions by a leader granted infinite power made his name synonymous with civic virtue, humility, and modesty, and they serve as an example of caring about the greater good. To understand the importance of these actions, one needs to zoom out and evaluate the time period in which they happened. At the time, the republic system was a novel occurrence in world history, to outsiders not necessarily different from a weird type of oligarchy. Furthermore, except for some initial reactions from the Etruscans directly after the founding of the republic, the system which dictates that the city leads itself was not really put to the test. It would have been completely understandable if, given the first opportunity, the city had turned back to a typical king-like government. The existence of a charismatic leader like Cincinnatus could easily be the catalyst to usher in the return to the era of kings if the incredibly popular Cincinnatus was inclined to take the power. Yet he chose not to, even after being granted ultimate authority twice. This was crucial, as these events happened during the second generation of the Republic, and it was the deeds of the second and third generation after the founding of the Republic that were the ones that truly solidified the belief and generational tradition of the system, which would come to be one of the most influential in human history. One can easily see how, had Cincinnatus chosen to exploit his position and his popularity, as the vast majority of world leaders have done throughout history, history itself, as we know it, might have been vastly different. And now for some bonus facts. Cincinnatus as a role model had many imitators throughout his time, some more successful than others. Sulla. Continuing with Rome during the late Republic, the political Sulla was, let's say, controversial to say the least. You know that retired authoritarian Navy SEALs commander from any movie? Well, multiply this by 10, add some crazy slaughtering frenzies, and there you have it. However, in 79 BC, after putting order to the Roman Empire and having been dictator since 81 BC, he resigned. His supporters would like to compare this to Cincinnatus, but it is a rather different situation, seeing as he did not step down to resume a simple life, but rather to write his memoirs in a fancy resort. Plutarch states that he retired to a life of luxury where he consorted with actresses, harpists, and theatrical people, drinking with them on couches all day long. So rather than stepping down to a simple life, it was more of a retirement package filled with partying and bliss without the cares, intrigue, and dangers that come with being dictator of Rome. In another contrast, his reforms did not ultimately make the impact he had hoped, and their results were completely thrown over after his death. The empire was founded just a few decades later. Diocletian. Another controversial Roman leader, now in the not-so-brand-new Empire edition, Marcus Diocletian. Ruling as emperor from 284 to 304 AD, Diocletian achieved what few did during the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. He not only survived long enough to establish political reforms, but actually managed to stabilize the empire for the time being. In 305 BC, he did what no Roman emperor had done before. He abdicated voluntarily and retreated to his palace on the Dalmatian coast, now the historic core of modern-day Croatia's city of Split, where he famously tended to his vegetable gardens. Not even lasting the duration of his retirement until his death in 311 AD, Diocletian established tetrarchy, the splitting of the empire among 4 rulers, collapsed into renewed chaos, and in 308 he was asked to return to power to help fix it. To this he replied, "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggesting that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed." While at first this might seem like the perfect comparison to Cincinnatus, it should also be stated that the reason for his retirement was first and foremost Diocletian's failing health and wish to live out his last days peacefully rather than dealing with the political intrigue of the day. In fact, in contrast to Cincinnatus, Diocletian's attitude can be seen more as abandoning the empire in a time of great need, something even the 80-year-old Cincinnatus was unwilling to do. George Washington. Skipping ahead hundreds of years and a vast number of governing changes in the Old World, the American nation appeared in the world scene with a tempo. One of the most peculiar characteristics of it was the idea of a blend of republic and democracy, with a small hint of dictator thrown in, but all carefully balanced to try and produce a system of government blending the best of human governing systems while mitigating the downsides. Today it might seem trivial, but with very few exceptions, like say the Netherlands, at the time Western countries had a king figurehead with varying degrees of authority, even in cases where parliamentarism had a long tradition, as was the case in England. For many, this experiment of reviving a political system based on ancient Rome was seen as weird, even eccentric. One of the many concerns was the stability of the system. Would Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and someone vastly popular with the general public and politicians alike, step down after victory? Well, no, of course he wouldn't. He'd become a king, or something amounting to the same position, just using a different title, and well, that's not actually what happened somewhat remarkably. He left office. Paralleling Cincinnatus, he left office because he respected the Constitution and the experiment that was this new form of government, a fact that demonstrated, among other qualities, civic virtue and modesty of character. In a final appearance in uniform, he gave a statement to Congress. "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have the superintendence of them to his holy keeping." It is difficult to imagine today, but stepping down after his presidential term was a sensation. Seeing the counterexample of, say, Napoleon crowning himself emperor or other personalities who would do anything to remain in power, Washington's resignation was acclaimed at home and abroad and showed a skeptical world that the new republic might just not degenerate into chaos or something completely different and more familiar to the world at the time. The parallels with Cincinnatus are obvious and were made even then. After the fact, a society of veterans of the American Revolutionary War, the Society of Cincinnati was founded with the motto Omnia Requignit Servi Republicarum. He relinquished everything to save the republic. The first major city to be founded after the war was aptly named Cincinnati, which is the genitive case of Cincinnatus, meaning belonging to that of Cincinnatus.
His Imperial Majesty Joshua Abraham Norton I was born between 1811 and 1818 in England. Records of his birth date vary considerably, but it's likely the latter date is the correct one. His family immigrated from South Africa when he was quite young, where his father headed a small Jewish community. As a young man, he initially attempted to run his own business in Cape Town, but quickly went bankrupt and started working at his father's ship chandlery instead. By 1848, Emperor Norton had suffered from some severe losses. His mother, his father, and both of his brothers had died. With no other family, Norton inherited all $40,000, about $1.1 million today, of his father's estate, and was eager to search for a new beginning. The lure of the American dream and the gold rush in particular drew Norton to San Francisco. He was eager to find his fortunes, though he wasn't interested in mining the gold fields. Instead, he started a small merchant business and rented out space on a ship he'd purchased for storage. Just a few years after his arrival in San Francisco, Norton was doing extremely well, with assets estimated to be worth around $250,000, which is about $6.8 million today. He had added to his collection of businesses a cigar factory, a rice mill, and an office building, but his fortune didn't last for very long. A famine in China cut off rice shipments, sending the price of rice skyrocketing from 4 to 36 cents per pound. Norton saw an opportunity to make even more money when Willie Sillum told him about a ship carrying Peruvian rice. If purchased, Norton would be able to undercut the market significantly, as he could get the shipment of Peruvian rice for just 12.5 cents per pound, nearly one-third of the going rate. Unfortunately, after putting a $2,000 deposit on a shipload of rice that would cost him $25,000 in total, more and more Peruvian ships carrying rice sailed into harbor. The price of rice dropped to 3 cents per pound, meaning Norton would not only not make a profit, but lose a significant amount of money in the process. He tried to nullify the contract on the grounds that Sillum had misled him. The incident resulted in a 2.5-year court battle, with the outcome in Sillum's favor. Norton had to pay the remaining $23,000. At this point, Norton was near ruin. The bank foreclosed on several of his businesses and properties. He was no longer able to stay at the ritzy hotels. The social elite wanted nothing more to do with him, and to top it all off, he was in court again, accused of embezzling funds from a client. By 1859, the once wealthy merchant who had it all was living in a working-class boarding house, down on his luck and seemingly incapable of any upward mobility. But that isn't the American way. When you're living on your last dollar and have nothing left to lose, what do? Well, you declare yourself Emperor of the United States. Of course. You see, Norton had long been critical of the United States government and was a fan of the British Empire. He felt like America was run on corruption, inefficiency, and self-interest, and that wasn't just because of his own losses. In 1859, California was caught up in the Great Slave Debate, which would eventually lead to the Civil War, and San Francisco's economy as a whole wasn't doing great as the gold rush died down. Norton remarked to a friend that things would be going a lot more smoothly if he was in charge. It's the kind of statement that no one expects anyone to act upon, but Norton was a stubborn, if unconventional man, and he decided to do something about it. On September 17, 1859, an unusual story was published in the San Francisco Bulletin. At the peremptory request of a large majority of the citizens of these United States, I, Joshua Norton, formerly of Algoa Bay, Cape of Good Hope, and now for the last 9 years and 10 months past of San Francisco, California, declare and proclaim myself the Emperor of these United States, and in virtue of the authority thereby in me vested, do hereby order and direct the representatives of the different states of the Union to assemble in Musical Hall of this city on the first day of February next, then and there to make such alterations in the existing laws of the Union as may ameliorate the evils under which the country is laboring, and thereby cause confidence to exist both at home and abroad in our stability and integrity. Settlers in the United States did consider themselves to be part of an empire. In San Francisco alone, there were buildings like the Empire Hotel, the Empire Brewery, and the Empire Fire Engine Company, among others. However, no one had yet been so bold to declare themselves emperor. It would have been easy enough to fob him off as a madman, but the San Francisco Bulletin continued to publish his demands and edicts. Norton I called for the dismantling of Congress and the abolishment of the Supreme Court. He fired Virginia Governor Henry A. Wise for sending John Brown of Harper's Ferry fame to the gallows. Norton was staunchly for equal rights for all. But he couldn't leave Virginia without a governor, so he replaced him with John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who was also known as the Vice President of the United States at the time. In 1860, the Congress of the United States convened against Emperor Norton I's orders. In retaliation, he ordered the Commander-in-Chief of the armies to clear the Hall of Congress. The man he was addressing was General Winfield Scott, who had commanded armies 15 years before, was now 74 years old, and living in the Washington Territory rather than Washington, D.C. That same year, Emperor Norton I declared the United States an absolute monarchy. In 1869, he abolished the Democratic and Republican parties. Now, obviously, none of Emperor Norton I's decrees ever came to fruition, at least not because of anything Norton said. Later, a few of his ideas would be independently implemented, such as a bridge being built between San Francisco and Oakland, and the formation of a League of Nations. As a self-proclaimed emperor with no army or money to back his proclamations up, he had no real legal power to create a monarchy, fire governors, or dismantle the Supreme Court. However, oddly enough, he did end up gaining power of a sort. Emperor Norton I quickly became a legend and was extremely popular among the people of San Francisco. Politicians were forced to humor him, because to show him disrespect was to lose votes. As an example of his popularity, Emperor Norton I was arrested once, but it wasn't for conspiracy to overthrow the government or anything of the sort. Rather, he was picked up for vagrancy and was later charged with lunacy. His arrest caused an outcry. Newspapers immediately took to the presses to urge the public to attend the emperor's hearing and protest the injustice against his imperial majesty. It produced the desired effect. Emperor Norton I was released with a full apology, and Police Chief Patrick Crawley ordered all police officers to salute Emperor Norton I when they passed him in the streets, where he could often be found inspecting the city and socializing with his subjects. The new emperor didn't live like a king, but his new life did provide a lot of perks other than salutes from police officers and a popular name in newspaper stories. He continued to rent a room in a cheap boarding house for just 50 cents a night. His clothes were largely cast-offs from his loyal subjects, including a few old army uniforms and a hat that was given to him by a shoekeeper, so that the shop could then be deemed outfitters to his imperial majesty. At a certain point, when his uniform became too worn, the city of San Francisco saw to it that he was given a brand new uniform to wear, as no emperor of the United States should go around in shabby clothing. Besides the free clothes, he was able to ride on San Francisco's public transportation for free, and was even given a free rail pass in the state of California. He was also given free meals in several restaurants, including very upscale establishments, where he was often treated as a VIP guest. Similarly, when he wished to attend a play, an opera, or the like, he typically had little trouble acquiring a box seat for free, and he was occasionally honored at such shows. When Emperor Norton I needed a bit of extra money, he went door to door, asking businesses for the tax due to him, which many fans would hand over. At other times, he simply printed his own money, which was honored by many businesses in San Francisco as if it were real currency. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Emperor Norton became something of a tourist attraction. Now, you're probably thinking, like most people at this point, that the man was utterly insane, and well, that's probably true, but he was also a businessman through and through. The emperor would meet with anyone who wanted to meet with him, and he sometimes traded some of his promissory notes with tourists in exchange for real currency. His notes would be repaid with 7% interest in 1880. Obviously, no one actually collected, because they really just wanted the emperor's signature. Similarly, various businesses were making significant amounts of money selling Emperor Norton I souvenirs, from postcards to dolls to cigars. They also put up signs in their windows that said, "By appointment of Emperor Norton I." And so it was that this nearly homeless man quickly became a national hero. Besides inspecting the city, doling out various decrees, and engaging anyone who would talk to him in philosophical debates, His Imperial Majesty once managed to do the near impossible: stop a mob in their tracks. While the details of the act have likely been blown out of proportion over time, at one point a mob was attempting to attack a Chinese immigrant. Not to be one to let such shenanigans take place in his country, Emperor Norton I set himself between the Chinese man and the attackers. Whether it was due to his own popularity in the town, or because he supposedly yelled out the Lord's Prayer repeatedly in the attackers' faces, the immigrant was saved and the mob dispersed. Unfortunately, after 21 years ruling the United States and later also protecting Mexico, on a sad day in January of 1880, the emperor suddenly fell to the sidewalk during his evening walk. He died before he could be taken to hospital. The Pacific Club of San Francisco set about raising funds for a proper high-end rosewood casket, as well as to cover other funeral expenses for Norton, who died nearly penniless, having chosen never to overtax his subjects. His death was lamented throughout the land. Around 10,000 people paid their respects at his funeral, with some newspaper accounts claiming as many as 30,000 people, about 13% of the population of San Francisco at the time, were lining the streets for the 2-mile procession to his gravesite. Newspapers across the country reported the death of the emperor. One newspaper, the Alta California, even dedicated 34 inches of print celebrating the life of the emperor. On the same day, it printed just 38 words from the new governor of California's inaugural speech.
Born into a poor peasant family in a foreign land, no one had worse odds to become the ruler of the Byzantine Empire than Basil. Yet, through a combination of hard work, scheming, murder, and competence, Basil ascended to the Byzantine throne and enjoyed 19 years of relatively peaceful rule. Authorities disagree over when and where Basil was born. Some place his birth year as 812 CE, while others see it as around 830 CE. Ethnically Armenian scholars also disagree over whether he was born in Thrace and then carried off with his peasant parents as captives of the Bulgarian Khan Krum, or if he was born in Macedonia after his parents were abducted. Whatever the case, he lived for a time in Macedonia, though Armenian was his first language, and he is reported to have spoken Greek, the language of Macedonia, with a notable accent. At some point, Basil, along with the other captives, escaped the Bulgarians and returned to their homes in Thrace around 836. Finding little opportunity there, he set off to make his fortune in the big city. His arrival in Constantinople has been transformed into legend since the actual event. As historian John Bagnall Bury notes of the fantastical story of Basil's arrival, on a Sunday near the hour of sunset he reached the Golden Gate, a poor, unknown adventurer with staff and scrib. He lay down to sleep in the vestibule of the adjacent church of St. Diomede. During the night, Nicholas, who was in charge of the church, was awakened by a mysterious voice saying, "Arise and bring Basilus into the sanctuary." He got up and, looking out, saw nothing but a poor man asleep. He lay down again, and the same thing was repeated. The third time he was poked in the side by a sword, and the voice said, "Go out and bring in the man you see lying outside the gate." He obeyed, and on the morrow he took Basil and adopted him as a brother. Regardless of the veracity of any supernatural claims for Basil's ascension, he was greatly helped by the monk Nicholas, who introduced him to the doctor of a very rich and well-connected man. This man's name was Theophilus. Possessing extraordinary strength, Basil was employed by the courtier, a relative of the Empress Theodora, as a groom. Together they traveled to Patrae on the Greek peninsula of Peloponnese. There Basil met and impressed the wealthy Danelese. Shortly thereafter, Basil fell ill and was left behind by Theophilus. When Basil recovered, Danellis became his patron and made him a wealthy man by bestowing on him slaves, gold, and other items, ostensibly in exchange for Basil taking her son under his wing. Nonetheless, Basil remained in Theophilus' service and eventually reunited with him in Constantinople. While attending a wrestling match, Basil was not originally one of the contestants, and because of his enormous strength, he was invited to take on that day's champion. According to one account, Basil threw the Bulgarian, squeezing him like a wisp of hay. From that day, the fame of Basil began to spread through the city. The triumph was eventually reported to the Emperor Michael III. Later, after Basil helped tame the Emperor's intractable new horse that had resisted all other efforts, Michael took Basil into his own service as a captain of the guard. Shortly thereafter, Basil was appointed to the post of High Chamberlain. Totally obedient to Michael, or seemingly so, Basil divorced his wife at Michael's command and married Michael's mistress in name only. Many scholars believe that the children of this marriage were actually Michael's, including Basil's successor, Leo VI. It is unclear if loyalty to Michael or personal ambition was the driving force behind Basil's next move. Basil had heard a rumor, or perhaps started one, depending on your point of view, that the emperor's right-hand man, the then second most powerful in the Byzantine Empire, Caesar Bardus, was planning to depose Michael. Basil tried to warn the emperor, but Michael did not believe him. So Basil conspired with other ambitious young men, including Symbatios, a young minister and son-in-law to Caesar Bardus. Together, they were able to convince Michael of Bardus's treachery, and Bardus was eventually murdered when
Basil and the other co-conspirators rushed in and hewed him in pieces right in front of Michael. Grateful to be rid of the traitor, Michael, who was officially childless, adopted Basil as his son and promoted him to the rank of Magister. Then, mysteriously, on the Pentecost, May the 26th, 867 CE, Michael crowned Basil Basilius and Augustus. On the steps before the Ambo in St. Sophia, Michael addressed his subjects. "The Caesar Bardas plotted against me to slay me, and for this reason induced me to leave the city. If I had not been informed of the plot by Symbatius and Basil, I should not have been alive now. The Caesar died through his own guilt. It is my will that Basil, the High Chamberlain, since he is faithful to me and protects my sovereignty, and delivered me from my enemy, and has much affection for me, should be the guardian and manager of my empire, and should be proclaimed by all as emperor." Although Michael's words were strong, the real effect was that Basil was in charge of the day-to-day operations of the empire, while Michael retained his position as the true emperor. And as you might be thinking right now, yes, this did not end well. Sure enough, the two had a falling out. Michael began to think Basil was getting too big for his britches, and he considered appointing another to Basil's place. One drunken evening, Michael told Basil, "I made you emperor, and have I not the power to create another emperor if I will?" Having a talent for murder by this point, Basil hatched a plot to kill Michael. On September the 24th, 867 CE, Basil enticed Michael to dinner. While Michael drank heavily, Basil made an excuse to leave briefly. He snuck into Michael's chambers and jerry-rigged the lock. Returning later with 8 buddies, Basil and his co-conspirators hacked at Michael, cutting off both of his hands before killing him. Basil's position as emperor, well, it was now secure. During his 19 years as emperor, Basil kept the ship of state on an even keel. He oversaw the creation of a set of laws known as the Basilica, which governed Byzantium until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. He also extended Byzantium's power by forming alliances with European rulers and establishing strongholds across the Adriatic and Mediterranean seas. His greatest gift, though, it might have been his understanding of human motivations. He successfully navigated difficult court politics and was able to keep its different factions from ever uniting against him. He also worked at maintaining a good image with the common man by living piously, providing orderly public services, and maintaining relatively light taxes. Basil died on August 28th, 886 CE. He was succeeded by his son, Leo VI, the Wise. In the video today, we are answering a viewer question because Jeremy R. asks us, who were the richest people in history? Wealth transcends time. It is also extremely hard to evaluate. There have been more than a few studies and lists that have tried to figure out who the richest people of all time are. This task has been proven to be nearly impossible, though. Accurately adjusting for inflation is, of course, one obstacle. It is very hard to account for what made up wealth throughout history in terms of valuing goods and the like, and what was used as currency has also varied throughout time, with valuing that presenting its own difficulties. Additionally, records and accounting have been lost. What we have to go on to determine who the wealthiest people are from hundreds of years ago are stories, legends, and other such written accounts. That being said, the question was asked, and we aim to please, so this here is our best attempt at a richest person list. We chose to organize it by century, dating back to the 11th century, as much accuracy any further back becomes a bit of an effort in futility, not only accounting for the lack of good records, but also when attempting to adjust the currency amounts to modern values, as we have done. Also, do note that we took the liberty of associating the person with the century where they were at the height of their wealth, since many people lived during 2 centuries. Feel free to quibble about all of that in the comments below. Any alternative suggestions would also be interesting in case we missed something in our research. But without further ado, let's get into it. Now let's start with the 11th century. William the Conqueror, worth approximately $230 billion in today's dollars. There is some thought that due to the vast natural resources and the power over the gold trade at the time, that King Tenkamenin of Ghana should be considered the richest man of the 11th century. However, when looking into it further, it seems there is more legend associated with this than anything else, so we'll go with the more concrete choice of William the Conqueror, the Norman King of England. He earned his wealth the old-fashioned way, by pillaging. When he was king, he also built many enormous castles across England, several of which still stand today. Moving on to the 12th century, Genghis Khan, his worth is a bit unknown. Due to incomplete and lost records, it was tough to determine who was truly the wealthiest person alive in the 12th century, but signs point to the famed Genghis Khan. His empire stretched into southern Europe, which may have been more than 4 billion acres of land. The treasures, gold, and valuables he plundered while taking this land were enormous. Despite all of this, there is the legend that he lived in a intent. Conquering and humiliating his enemies, it would seem, and not necessarily garnering wealth, is what drove him. 13th century, Filippo de Amadeo de Peruzzi, worth approximately $100 billion to $200 billion. There is a case that could be made for Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai, but other sources point to the wealthiest banker in the world's wealthiest city, and that's Florence, Italy. Filippo de Amadeo de Peruzzi and his family underwrote businesses, owned ships, ran hotels, and stockpiled gold, spices, and jewelry. In fact, Peruzzi was so wealthy that monarchs and popes asked him for loans. Even when Filippo passed away in 1303, his family continued to do business, to the point that 150 years later they loaned Edward III of England money to finance the 100 Years' War. When he couldn't pay back his loan, much of the Peruzzi's wealth was lost. They were also kicked out of Florence by the victorious King of France. 14th century, Mansa Musa I, worth approximately $400 billion. The richest person in history wasn't Bill Gates or John D. Rockefeller, but rather the 14th century ruler of West Africa's Malayan Empire, covering modern-day Ghana, Timbuktu, and Mali. The vast natural resources of the region, which included salt and gold, contributed to his enormous wealth. He built numerous gold-plated mosques, and a few of these still stand today. The 14th century actually has several different people that dot the list of wealthiest people in history, including Richard Fitzalan, worth approximately $118 billion, and John of Gaunt, worth approximately $110 billion. 15th century, Jakob Fugger, worth approximately $60 to $275 billion. Fugger was another bankman who loaned money to Charles V to ensure that he got elected as the Holy Roman Emperor. In turn, Charles V gave Fugger the right to mint his own money. Yes, he was so rich he could literally make money. The reason the exact value is so wide in its range is due to the unknown value of the vast properties and merchant fleets that he owned. Either way, he was known to many as Jacob the Rich, which probably tells you all you needed to know. The 16th century, Suleiman the Magnificent, worth unknown. As ruler of the great and vast Ottoman Empire, Suleiman's wealth could be measured in power, land, gold, jewels, and apparently giant hats. But some measured his wealth in the number of women in his harem, which was rumored to go beyond 2,000. Suleiman was the longest reigning monarch of the Ottoman Empire, which was at its height during his rule. By many accounts, he was also a big fan of social reform and protected his subjects by enacting anti-discrimination laws that prevented unfair treatment based on bloodlines. 17th century, Aurangzeb, worth rumored approximately to be about $19 billion. He became ruler of India when he won the War of Succession over his three brothers and threw his father in jail, though supposedly he did not mistreat him beyond that. It was said that he made about $38 million in tribute, so over the 49 years of his reign, that is about $19 billion today, give or take. In other words, he was worth about 10 times the amount of his European contemporary, Louis XIV of France. 18th century, Stephen Girard, worth approximately $105 billion. This was a tough century because several moguls amassed their wealth in the 18th century but continued to accumulate it into the 19th. The French-born naturalized American, who personally underwrote and saved America from financial collapse during the War of 1812, seems as good of a choice as any. He owned many ships and banks, making him responsible for most of the trade that came into the major ports of late 18th century America. Considered the fourth richest American ever, he had no children and left much of his money to his adopted hometown of Philadelphia. 19th century. The Rothschild family, worth approximately $350 billion. As a family of London-based bankers, this fortune cannot be attributed to one person, though Nathan Meyer was the wealthiest of the four original brothers. It all began with them helping to finance the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, which led to their first billion. From that point on, they combined likely amassed the largest private fortune in modern history. The dynasty continues to this day in Europe with valuable real estate and energy investments, with some economists believing the Rothschild family wealth actually totals over $1 trillion combined. 20th century. John D. Rockefeller, worth approximately $340 billion. As the 19th century turned into the 20th century, the greatest commodity in the world wasn't land or people or harems, but oil. And J.D. Rockefeller was an oil man who reaped the rewards of it. He is generally considered to have been around the third richest man ever when normalizing for inflation. As the head of Standard Oil, there was a point where he oversaw 90% of the world's oil production. If that wasn't enough, in 1911, when the Sherman Antitrust Act broke up Standard Oil into 34 separate companies, Rockefeller actually made an extra $900 million. All in a rich guy's day at work, apparently. 21st century, Muammar Gaddafi, worth approximately $200 billion. We are only 19 years into the century, but the richest person of the 21st century is considered to be about the 8th richest person in all of history, give or take. And it isn't Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, or Warren Buffett. Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi ruled over an oil-rich country for 34 years before being ousted and then killed. Upon his death, much to the surprise of many, billions upon billions of dollars were found in various accounts of his across the globe. In the few years since his death, nearly $200 billion has been found in secret bank accounts, real estate holdings, and other investments. No matter whether he acquired it legally or not, money is money, and Gaddafi secretly had the most of any known person so far this century.